Hi, everyone. We are here with our third day of opening ceremony for the planet-wide SOS Hackathon. We have a big program for today. We will start with our mentor and friend, Paul Brody from Ernst & Young, and I'm going to take a time to introduce him a little bit more later. We also will continue with our friend and mentor and sponsor Stani Kuleshov from AAVE. Then we'll continue with a panel of honored guests and also our friends discussing a DAO. This panel will have Vitalik Buterin, Nataliya Hearn, Joel Telpner, Ben Goertzel, and Lucia Gallardo, and will be led by Amber Scott from Outlier Solutions. And then we finish with a presentation from our co-organizer, Eylon Aviv, about DAO. So this is the program for today. Please stay with us. And we are moving on to our first speaker, Paul Brody. So let me introduce him properly. So Paul is responsible for driving Ernst & Young initiatives and investments in blockchain worldwide. With blockchain services teams in Americas, Europe, and Asia, Paul's team work with the service lines to build a portfolio of service across tax, audit, and business transformation. He has extensive experience in the areas of IT, supply chain, and operations and business strategy, developed over 20 years at multiple startups, McKinsey, and at IBM. Paul also has a BA in economics and certificate in African studies from Princeton University. Very amazing, very impressive. It's all yours, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's really delightful to be here today. I'm Paul Brody. I am the global blockchain leader at EY, and it is really my pleasure to be talking to all of you today about this hackathon. And the topic I want to get to today is around this idea of making something that matters, right? So hackathons produce enormous amounts of stuff. We have hackathons at EY, even internally. We have hackathons externally. We participate in hackathons like this. And one of the things that has struck me over the years in talking to people who do the work on the output of hackathons is that oftentimes the ideas are great, but the product of these hackathons isn't that useful. And it's not useful because it overlooks some of the key lessons that people in the industry have already learned. And so my goal today is to do a couple of things. Number one, share with you some of our thinking about what actually gets adopted and used, and share with you also some of the lessons learned that we've had, because we've been kicked in the teeth a few times, and that's part of running an organization where you serve clients, right? Not everything that you do is successful, and not all of your clients' ideas are successful. And so I hope to do that today, and to talk you a little bit through some of our reasoning and logic. I'll caution you that the way that we think about stuff at EY isn't a consumer-focused product. We're a large enterprise-focused organization. We are primarily professional services and accounting and audit and tax. And so what that means is we serve large companies. In fact, we're one of what's called the Big Four, the large four global audit firms. And we're the only one of the Big Four that's really investing in blockchain technology, especially kind of research and development, core technology, and public blockchains. And so with that knowledge, I want to go ahead and jump into my presentation. Let me get this set up here properly, share the screen. Share my presentation. And all right. So like I said, let's make something that matters. Let's start by talking about solving problems that matter, how you make things that are useful, and a little bit of learning from our mistakes and where we see things going in the future. Let me start by talking about solving problems that matter with blockchain, because when you think about blockchain, the painful fact about blockchain is everything that you can do on the blockchain, I can also do for you in a web server. And if I make it on a traditional web server in a classic Web 2.0 environment, which is much more mature, has much better developed ecosystem, I can build it better, faster, and cheaper. So it is a reasonable question for you to ask, why should I do anything on the blockchain? And there are good answers to that question, but you need to know why you're doing it. And in my own personal view, the big answer is the one thing that blockchains do that traditional IT systems don't is they allow you to transact securely and reliably without an intermediary. If your business case, if your vision doesn't require independence from an intermediary, then maybe it's not that useful, or what you're doing could be more easily and more simply done without a blockchain, right? And my favorite example here is centrally controlled marketplaces. If there has been a feature of the global economy over the last 20 years, it's been the rise of these digitally connected marketplaces, right? It started with eBay, but in fact, almost all consumer commerce today goes to one of these digitally connected centralized marketplaces. Now, these marketplaces, their job is to connect buyers and sellers, but they do more than that. They sell their own product. They can see all the information in the network, right? And what always ends up happening is these marketplaces that start out with this great vision of connecting buyers and sellers and digitizing the world's commerce discover that the information that they are transacting and the visibility that they have to everybody's buying and selling and what they need and how much they're paying for it, that's more valuable than the industry itself. And they inevitably turn into predators who use that privileged centralized information against the competition, right? And blockchains allow us to churn back time and have a level playing field between the participants. We can have digital connectivity. We can have digital transfers and payments. We can have smart contracts that allow us to implement business logic. And we can do all of that without having that centralized intermediary that can tilt the playing field, right? And so I believe this is the big value proposition of blockchain. It's what we see as critical for the business-to-business environment, right? This is a trend that you should be concerned about, because the fact is that the last 20 years, right, software hasn't just eaten the world, it has transformed the global economy. And in particular, if you look carefully at this amazing chart from The Economist, what you will see is that more and more industry is concentrated in a very small number of really big companies, right? So if you look at this chart from The Economist, what you'll see is that everything above the line, above the diagonal line, is industries that are becoming more concentrated and more centralized, and industries below that line are becoming less so. Well, no surprise, the vast majority of those bubbles are on the more concentrated side of the line. And the reason is fairly simple. Software has zero marginal cost. The more software I put in a business, right, the more software dependent my business is, right, the easier it is, right? And making another copy of software costs nothing. So if I do something once, right, my second customer, the real cost is zero. That's a huge advantage, right? Network effects are the second huge driver, right? If I have 5 companies on a network, the 6th company makes the network more valuable, and the 6,000th company or the 6 millionth customer even more so. But what's really driven market dominance over the last 20 years is this, right? Vendor lock-in, right? It's once you become connected to a network, dependent on software, leaving that network is really hard. It's why we tend to only have one really big market intermediary by market. It's why we often have only one big social network, one big digital platform. Oftentimes there's one sort of humongous platform and maybe one sort of smaller player, but the result is market dominance, right? And it's really hard to break in because this company that you're competing against has millions of customers. That's where everybody else uses their stuff, right? But it does not have to be that way, right? You can still, with blockchains, have the beauty of software, zero marginal cost, and you can have the power of network effects. But on a blockchain, you can have open access. And the result of that means anybody can join, everyone can compete on a level playing field, and instead of having a single company dominating and monetizing a market, you have a highly competitive level playing field, right? We have a chance with blockchain not just to make a few cool software startups, we have a chance to make the global economy fairer for everybody. I know sometimes this makes me sound like a bit of like an idealist crank, but I sincerely believe this, right? And let me just sort of put this in highlight for you, right? This is a really amazing chart, which kind of blew my mind. Zoom, which is a product I love, and I am not here to criticize Zoom. Zoom is now worth more than the world's top 7 airlines combined. Zoom has 2,500 employees. The US airline industry, which isn't even the top 7, employs 621,000 people, right? It matters to have a level playing field. It matters that software is not just driving enormous return on investment for a relatively small number of organizations, because that kind of business model is decoupled from how people make their living, right? And those 2,500 employees are well paid at Zoom, but so are the hundreds of thousands of airline pilots and flight attendants. They are good jobs that people can get, right? And if you think about how capital is allocated and the level playing field, right, this is something we should care about. By the way, this is not a new problem, right? It's really funny. Like, every generation thinks they've discovered this problem anew, but this is actually a relatively old problem. And it's even in the digital era, it's quite old. This problem was first discovered in the 1970s and the 1980s. Back in the 1950s, right? And the fact that I know this, it does not mean that I am incredibly old. I'll just go ahead and be honest here, right? I've got lots of gray hair, but I spend a lot of time at IBM. And back in the 1950s, IBM and American Airlines created the world's first airline reservation system. It's called SABRE, Semi-Automatic Business Research Environment. I know, very cool name, kind of strange, right? And actually, I've got a picture here, right? I mean, literally, it was built on like a IBM Selectric typewriters. There's a picture down there of the newer model. But here's what's really amazing about SABRE. SABRE led to the world starting to digitize every single seat on every flight on every airline. Literally, this was the first market, airline travel, that had every product available in a digital marketplace. Now, what did SABRE do? They did what any great intermediary did, because they were the first and the biggest. If you search the flight from San Francisco to New York, guess whose flights came up first? American Airlines, right? And in fact, the power of being the world's leading airline reservation system was so immense that at some point during the 1990s, SABRE was worth more than American Airlines, right? Because of that power. And in fact, the US Justice Department intervened and required the reservation systems to list flights fairly and correctly because of the power of these intermediaries. Now, that was a very early stage model, but this has been replicated over and over and over again. And we keep forgetting that we've actually seen this movie before. So I once explained blockchain to my mother. She was a mainframe software developer in the 60s and 70s. She actually just recently retired. She's been teaching my kids coding, but she said, that's fantastic. We've basically just been replaying the same thing from like 1966, right? And yes, that's true, but blockchain is different, and it has the chance for us to try to change the course of how this world goes. So how do we make something that goes from a great idea that's built on lovely idealistic ideas, right, into something that people can actually use, right? And I believe there's kind of 3 key ingredients for making genuinely useful stuff come out of hackathons. Number 1, open source code, right? And by the way, when I say open source code, I do not mean some kind of strange open source license with all kinds of strange terms and conditions attached to it, right? That's a relatively recent trend. At EY, we have been making open source code, and we've actually been putting in the public domain. No catches, no strings attached, nothing. Number 2, open public networks. So one of the tricks that I've seen adopted lately is for companies to say, yes, our code is open source, but the network is closed. It's kind of the same effect, right? Yes, you can have the open source code. Fat lot of good it will do you if you can't join the network easily, or you have to pay some gatekeeper to join the network, right? That's what I call fake open source. And then finally, and I think really importantly, design for privacy, right? The fact is, if you work in the world of enterprises, no one is going to do anything without privacy. If my competitors can see what I'm buying and how much I'm paying, I'm not going to join the system. So these things are really important, and I'll share with you a little bit of kind of our path and experience, right? Let me start actually with this intersection of privacy and open networks. Centralized systems, and by that I mean classic Web 2.0, they offer very high level of privacy, provided that the person operating it wishes to give you that privacy. They have very low levels of security because they are a single point of failure, but they're massively scalable, right? People always say, oh, Visa, MasterCard, they can transact, bazillions of transactions per second. Yes, centralized systems are probably unbeatable when it comes to transactions per second now, or incredibly fast trading speed. By the way, I hear this all the time from clients, like, well, I don't know, blockchain, is that going to be fast enough for me? Yes, right? You may know, many of you may know, some of you may not know, depending on how many of you are sort of still in university. I certainly didn't. When companies talk about net 30, right, what that means is that if I send you a bill, I expect you to pay it in 30 days. Most companies that transact with each other, they transact with each other over 30, 60, 90-day cycles, right? And you've got somebody saying, well, your transaction system might not be good enough because it takes 15 seconds. Don't be ridiculous, right? This idea that decentralized systems are somehow impossibly slow only applies to stock traders and maybe credit card processors. And then finally, in centralized systems, intermediaries are all powerful. They're not just powerful, they're all powerful. They can see everything, they can do everything, they can do whatever they want. Private blockchains are kind of a bit of a messy compromise, right? They offer a very low level of privacy. It's not zero, but it's relatively low. They have somewhat more scalability theoretically, and I say theoretically because we haven't seen a lot of evidence to support that. They have a relatively low level of scalability, but they have better security because there are potentially multiple points of failure in the network. And the intermediaries are not all powerful, right? The rules of the system are visible to everybody. That's kind of how the blockchains work. But because it's a closed network, they decide if you can join or not. The intermediary can decide if you join or not, and then they can decide to charge you for how much you join. And they can also make sure that if I'm a company of type A in this network, I can also work with the intermediary to make sure that my competitors are not admitted, right? It's a great way to run a network without having any competition. And by the way, that's kind of pointless, right? If you care about disruption, you need competition. Public blockchains are the best option, right? The level of privacy in public blockchains started out at 0, but it is going up significantly, right? They offer by far the highest standard of security. They offer what I would call the platinum standard for security, right? The gold standard is open source code. The platinum standard is I have open source code on an open network, and there is a sizable community of subject matter experts who review what's going on, right? That is the platinum standard for security, and no closed system or private blockchain can meet that standard, right? And very importantly, scalability is rising. Like if you listen to what people said a couple years ago, like, oh, they'd be like, oh, Ethereum public blockchains, they'll never scale. They are scaling very nicely. And they are very unfairly comparing the scalability of Ethereum to systems that are 30 or 40 years old. Maturity brings scalability. And most importantly, the intermediaries have no power, right? There are no all-powerful centralized intermediaries. Now, I want to make one more really important point here, because people get really confused about the difference between an intermediary that controls the network and a trusted third party, right? In the internet is a public decentralized network, right? The internet that we use all the time. Now, it doesn't mean that there are no trusted third parties on the internet, right? There are, right? We depend on security certificate issuers. We depend on all kinds of services, antivirus, other things, and we trust some entities more than others, right? And accounting firms are a really good example of this, right? If you go to the public markets, you really trust, you depend upon an accounting firm to tell you through audits how well a company keeps their books and how reliable they are. It's not an absolute guarantee, right? But they are a trusted third party. And very importantly, they're not an all-powerful intermediary. You have a choice of accounting firms. You have a choice of law firms. You have a choice of security certificate providers. And so in the world of public blockchains, you can have people with a role of trusted third party that doesn't make them all powerful, right? And so no one should confuse those two things. All right, private blockchains, just to give a really good example, they have not solved this privacy problem very well. And the result is very low adoption. Companies love to use private blockchains because they feel like it's a good way to get their feet wet, but the results haven't been very good. We talked to 230 companies and we asked them what they had done in regards to blockchain, right? They had done something, we asked them a bit more, and 1% of them said they had joined a consortium, an industry consortium. 30% had joined somebody else's blockchain. But 2/3, 67% had started their own. Now, you do not have to be a math genius to figure out that that means that the average private blockchain has 0.5 users. What's the point? The answer is there isn't one, right? And so this model of I'm going to have all these different overlapping silos of blockchains, a logistics blockchain here and a retail blockchain there, it doesn't work. The good news is that everybody is learning from their mistakes, right? And so if we then ask them, these same companies, what do you see the future as? And overwhelmingly, 75% of them said in the future, they believe public blockchains are the right way to go. Now, all of that depends on privacy, but public blockchains means no lock-in, no risk of having your data monetized, no barriers to bringing your business partners on there. And this is why I talk about this combination. It's not enough just to have open source software. You also need open networks. And as a result of that, you end up with a much better experience. And I tell my clients, you can pack up and leave us tomorrow, and we will have no power over you. And so you should not fear doing business with us. You should not fear that we might end up in a period of position of immense power, because with the open standards and public blockchains, if you decide you want to work with somebody else, you can. You can literally take your stuff and move away. And yes, it'll take you some time and energy to find a new provider, but we have no meaningful long-term power over you. And that should make you more comfortable working with us. So please learn from our mistakes, right? You know, I've talked a little bit about why I think public domain systems matter, why open networks matter. Let me share with you a little bit of our history, right? The last 12 months, indeed, the last couple of years for blockchain have been somewhat challenging, right? Large companies were getting at this point, they stopped, but there was a wonderful time where people would come to me like, I have $500,000, what kind of blockchain can I get for that? And I'd be like, a purple one for you. Right? We can get blockchains, right? High volatility, not great returns on crypto assets, right? Lots and lots and lots of fraud in the ICO space, which definitely damaged the industry, and a lot of regulatory uncertainty, right? That was generally the crypto environment. And in particular for enterprises, and ours included, right? There have been a lot of challenges, right? It is very complicated sometimes to explain the return on investment. And honestly, it should not be. Right? If you need more than 1 or 2 slides to explain the value of what you're doing, it's not working, right? And by the way, something that does 25 things is not that useful. You need things that do 1 or 2 things really well. I feel like inside of EY, I have become known as Dr. No, because people come to me like, well, we could do this and they can do all these things and they can make coffee as well. I'm like, no, too complicated, right? People buy solutions to do solve one problem well, right? Too complicated to use. I am hugely guilty here. So companies use large enterprise systems to manage their operations, right? They have automated systems. If you pull a packet of potato chips off the shelf in Omaha, right, that triggers an order through a system that will replenish that packet of potato chips if it was the last one on the shelf. Well, all of that stuff happens behind the scenes. There's no user interface. There's no person at the centralized warehouse saying, let's put in another packet of chips. That's not how it works, right? It's all automated. And I thought, okay, if all this stuff is going to be automated, if it's all going to be system to system, do we need a nice user interface? It turns out the answer is yes. It turns out that if you cannot visually demonstrate what's going on, people are not going to understand it, right? And a lot of our stuff looked too complicated to use and deploy, right? And then finally, we weren't good at explaining the security, and especially before in the early days, the maturity of the privacy model especially was too weak, right? Now, and as a result, we had trouble selling solutions. And we had a lot of clients that were like, this looks amazing. Call us when you have somebody else using it, right? That is not a recipe for success. So you have to keep it simple, solve one problem, and make it visually easy to understand. Now, did we expect this to happen? Yes, I can honestly say we had a lot of foresight in this in this market, right? All technology markets go through this boom and bust cycle, right? And when I first went up in front of the global executive at EY almost 5 years ago, I showed them this chart. I said, I want you to look at this chart. This is the Gartner hype cycle from 2002. And if you went to Gartner, which is one of the world's top technology analyst firms, and said in 2002 and said, tell me what's hot and what's not, they would have said grid computing and biometrics, super hot. And you'd be like, okay, so what's not hot? And they'd be like, oh, we're really down on speech recognition. It's probably never going to work, right? And e-payments, public key infrastructure, Bluetooth, those all look kind of messy. Well, lo and behold, 20 years later, we use every single one of those things every single day, right? Do not allow the ups and downs of industry analysts, pundits, and silly people who write newspaper columns to change how you feel about the power of technological change, right? I was a McKinsey consultant back in the late 90s, and it was a great, fun, and exciting time. But I listened to people say things like, no one's ever going to buy groceries online, right? Who's going to buy clothes online, right? We do all of that stuff all the time, right? So the foundations for long-term market success come actually at the time when everybody says it's stupid and pointless, right? And I want to give you a particular sense of that because it's really important. Imagine this is a classic S-curve. This is how software gets adopted or technology gets adopted. And we are now past the early adoption surge where people are like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I got to try it out. We are now in the trough of disillusionment. This is where adoption slows because people are like, wow, this thing is more difficult than I thought. I don't understand the use case. I don't understand how to use it. The security doesn't look good. It doesn't seem as nice as the other stuff, right? When we get through this, we hit what I think of as the inflection point. This is when somebody figures out how to make this technology simple, accessible, usable, massively scalable. If you think about the cloud, I personally think the inflection point was the launch of AWS in 2006, right? The cloud was around before 2006, but it wasn't simple to use. And Amazon gave it a very simple use case, store data off-site, right? And they gave it a simple UI. And all of a sudden, boom, we were off and running, right? And you went through this period of mainstream adoption, right? You went from like 20% to 80%. And then finally, you got into this period of late adopters. Now, each one of these phases has their own special kind of experience, right? First of all, the thing you should know is that when it comes to enterprise technology, it's a lot longer than consumers. In my house, I am the CIO, the CTO, the CFO, and the general counsel, right? If I want to use technology, I'm allowed to do so, provided my husband lets me. But in most companies, you need to talk to like 20 committees to get that stuff done, right? Once you hit the inflection point, though, it takes about 10 years for companies to really pick stuff up. Large enterprises are conservative. They don't move quickly. I can't tell you how many clients we've said, yes, that sounds awesome. We just don't want to go first. I still have clients who are like, I don't know about this cloud thing, right? It's 2020, and there are still companies, not a lot. There's still companies, though, that are not comfortable with cloud, right? Now, by the way, when the mainstream adoption period begins, that's when you'll hear some of your competitors be like, oh, yeah, it's cloud thing. Yes, it's true. We're not in it today, but it's early days yet, right? The most important thing I can tell you is this. Once you've entered into the mainstream adoption period, it's game over. If you have not launched your product, if you do not understand this market, it's over, right? The growth is gone. The growth is taking place, but the battle for market share is happening here in the trough of disillusionment, right? This is where the hard work is being done, right? And go and look at the market share data. Amazon dominated this business starting in when they launched AWS, and they have never been unseated from their leadership position, right? By the time everybody figures out that this blockchain thing is actually going to work and be amazing, it will be too late for those who didn't play, right? They just get to sit on the sidelines and watch what happens. So yes, we made a lot of mistakes, but we are still in this game and we are fighting our way through it. And if you were to boil down all of our strategy at EY into a single sentence, it would be this. We believe that blockchains will do for networks of companies or business ecosystems what ERP did inside the single enterprise. Now, not everybody has had the joy of learning what ERP is, and I'm not really sincere when I say joy, but ERP are the systems that large companies use to manage their own internal processes. It's called enterprise resource planning. And like all modern IT concepts, it originated in like the 1960s at IBM. I will not go into the history, but the idea is simple. The left hand and the right hand in large companies need to know what's going on. The beauty of large companies is there's a CEO at the top and he or she can say, you will all use this piece of software and we will all comply with it, right? It's top down, right? And it's intermediary driven. The good news is you're your own intermediary. Once you leave the four walls of the company, that's no longer true, right? And so you don't have that. But with blockchain, we can have useful, organized process between companies without a forceful central intermediary. And all you need are tokens and contracts, right? If you think about it, this is how companies interact with each other. I have money, you have stuff, and we are going to exchange them subject to the terms and conditions of a business agreement. That's all it is. So if you have enough tokens, right, that represent real or virtual items that you're exchanging, whether it's money or product, and you have business contracts that represent business process and rules and agreements, then you really have everything that you need to model and run a business process between two enterprises. Throw in a little bit of analytics and you kind of have a complete set of tools to run a business, right? And doing that, we have gradually and consistently managed to grow our business, right? Now, the last couple of years definitely been slower than the blistering pace of 2018 and 2017, but still kind of moving along nicely across a bunch of different dimensions, right? And very importantly, we've started to encounter some repeatable things that clearly add value. One of the most substantive ones is supply chain management, right? Digital tokens are stuff, and keeping track of it really, really matters. A lot of companies woke up at the beginning of this COVID-19 crisis to discover that their diversified global supply chains all ended at the same vendor in China, right? Because they didn't know where stuff was actually coming from. But over and over again, we found is that clients are willing to pay for traceability, to understand a digital token, where did it go, right? How is it represented as that product as it moved across the supply chain? And that's been true with food and beverage, with drug traceability, with shipping and logistics, funds management, all kinds of stuff. You name it, you can think of it. People want to know where it came from and where it's going, right? And along the way, in spite of all the mistakes we've made, we started to accumulate a great list of clients who really understand the value here. Number two, we're an audit firm. And as one of my colleagues loves, she has a great joke. She says, if you work with Ernst & Young, you're less likely to go to prison. I think it's humorous. I think it's true. I hope it's true. I really think it's true. But the reality is large companies are risk averse. But one of the ways that they manage risk is that they invite auditors in to tell them that they're doing it properly, right? And as an audit firm, one of the things that we can do proactively to support this business is audit business transactions, to be able to tell clients, you're not going to jail. You are doing it properly. And right now we audit over 130 companies. They do their financial statements, right? And again, this is one of the silly things. People who are anti-blockchain, they tell their clients, oh, this might end you up in jail. Blockchains are for criminals. We beg to differ, right? We have 130 clients who do business transactions using cryptocurrencies and digital assets. And this time, as this speaking, I'm pretty sure none of them are in prison. So, and by the way, us CFO types, the financial people, we do not fare well in prison, right? We've got some cool stuff going as well that I'm very proud of that really makes a good public contribution. We have a tool that we've developed called Public Finance Manager, and it's a public accountability and a kind of anti-corruption tool. One of our first clients is the City of Toronto, and they're using it to help manage their budgets. They have budgets for things like education and healthcare, and those budgets fund programs, right? And the programs have projects, and they do things like vaccinate people and build new MRI machines or equip schools full of computer labs. And one of the things that they want to know better and faster is, how quickly and how well does money that goes into programs feed back into results for our taxpayers and citizens? And using a blockchain, they're able to connect all the participants in this network without forcing everybody to use the same centralized IT system, right? The other thing that we've done is we've launched our first true software as a service application, which is smart contract testing and review. And what we did was we allow users to paste in their software token code, their ERC20 code, and it will then test it against a bunch of different standards. It will test it to see, does this code, for example, comply with the ERC20 standard, right? You say it's an ERC20, well, that's a standard. We can actually test to see if it complies with this standard. Does it have known security problems? It can't find unknown security problems, but it can definitely find the ones that we know about. How is the code quality, right? Is this properly done? Are you using best practices for things? And is the code efficient, right? And over the last year or two, we've built 87 ERC20 specific tests and another 58 general tests, right? That allow you to test and validate this so that you can make sure as you're writing code that it properly complies with industry standards and known security issues, right? By the way, this service is free of charge for everybody. So if you want to use it and you're coding stuff and you're building an ERC20 token during this hackathon, just go to blockchain.ey.com, sign up and use it. It's available in most countries where the regulations allow us to make it available, and it is entirely free of charge. All you have to do is register, no catches. We're going to expand this over the coming years to include user-defined tests, simulation of transactions on the mainnet, etc. So we believe, as we go forward, that the future business-to-business transactions are private, secure, regulatory compliant. This is the whole no go to jail thing. Smart contracts on fiat currencies, right? As in dollars, euros, yen, not Ether. And I'll come back to the second, on public blockchains. Now, why not Ether? We're not anti-cryptocurrency, but if you're a large company, you don't want to transact in a foreign currency, right? So if your revenues are in dollars, if people are buying whatever it is they're buying from you, dollars or euros or yen or whatever, right? If your revenues are in dollars, euros, and yen, and you're paying your employees and your taxes in dollars, euros, and yen, you would like to also manage all of your transactions in dollars, euros, and yen. And that's why the rise of stablecoins is so immensely important, because companies don't want to change into a foreign currency to do a transaction and then change it back into a local currency. That's foreign exchange risk, and generally the CFOs of large companies hate risk. They're just terrified of risk, right? The biggest thing I believe that at EY we have done right over the last couple of years is invest in privacy and security. And in particular, if you go back into the history, Zcash was really groundbreaking, right? It was the first blockchain tool that supported privacy. And Vitalik was truly a visionary in 2017 when he took some of those core functions and put them into Ethereum. And so once he did that, we started adapting and leveraging the inspiration of Zcash to implement secure private transfers on the public Ethereum blockchain. And I'm very proud to say we were the first people to do that. And we can do both ERC20 and fungible and non-fungible tokens. Now, what's exciting is we made huge progress in that department. So our prototype, which we launched in October 2018 at the Ethereum Summit, it only cost $100 in gas to do a transaction, right? Which pretty much rules out any reasonable number of transactions. By April of 2019, when we introduced our software called Nightfall, we had it down to about $10. And as of December of last year, we have it down to 5 cents. So at 5 cents for a private transaction, that is worthwhile doing. And by the way, our software, Nightfall, is free, public domain, and open source. It is open to anybody you want. And I want to encourage you, if you are building a token transfer mechanism, right, this is the easiest way to do it with privacy, right? And by the way, not only can you do it with privacy, but you can do it with regulatory compliance, because the newest version supports whitelists, blacklists, and transaction auditing. It's free. It's built as a set of library tools. If you are going to build something, you want people to use it, just use this software to help you manage private transactions. It will make it possible for you to do something that enterprises will be open to, because they will privacy will be respected. It's totally free. We don't ever make a penny out of it. We created this to drive adoption and to create solutions that enterprises would want to use. I hear also from time to time that some individuals care about their privacy too, by the way. Now, having gotten private payments and transfers done, that did not mean that we were by any means done. In fact, we identified a bunch of additional challenges that exist in order to get the whole thing done, right? It's not enough just for me to pay you, right? I go back to I have money, you have stuff, we're going to exchange them subject to the terms of the agreement. We have to figure out how to make those agreements more private. And we have to make sure that I am who I am and you are who you are, right? So what we did was about a year ago, we teamed up with Microsoft and Consensus to create something called the Baseline Protocol. And our goal is to fill in all the remaining gaps so that you can have a truly secure, regulatory compliant, private transaction on the public Ethereum network, right? And we can do that with the Baseline Protocol without ever putting any enterprise information or personal information on the chain, right? And that's a huge milestone, because if you think about GDPR or data sovereignty rules, if you're putting actual personal data or business data on the public blockchain, you are probably in violation of GDPR and data sovereignty rules. But you don't need to do that. And there are ways to do that with off-chain storage, hashes, links, mathematical proofs. It is all there for you. It's not easy to use it because it's still relatively immature, but I believe this is kind of an essential thing. Working with Microsoft and Consensus, we now have more than 20 companies that are part of this group, and this is probably not an easy time to get involved, but later on, I highly recommend you get involved, and I've got some links at the end. We have built our newest product around the Baseline Protocol, and I just want to share with you this because I want to give you an example of a very specific use case that we have created. It's called EY Ops-Chain Network Procurement. And the idea is to take a very typical procurement process. This is how most companies transact with each other, right? They do one thing with each other almost all the time. They buy stuff from each other, right? If you're not a financial services entity, if you're not a bank or a Wall Street trading firm, the way the two companies interact is they buy stuff, right? You say, I need this. And you say, okay, I'm going to bid on it, et cetera, right? And it turns out that this process is really, really broken because the world has changed beyond recognition in the last 40 or 50 years. And most of the software that supports enterprise procurement hasn't, right? And I really wanted us to do one thing well with Baseline before we kind of made it generally available. Some of you are saying, well, what has changed? The answer is we no longer really work as centralized organizations. I'm a huge fan of industrial history. And if you're a fan of industrial history, you know that 50 or 60 years ago, Ford's River Rouge factory was considered kind of the global gold standard in factories. Like, it's an exaggeration, but not a huge one, to basically say dirt went in on one side and cars came out the other. They had a steel mill there, they had a tire factory, they had a glass works, they made everything there themselves. And the number one job at Ford in those days was managing themselves, right? Dirt, it turns out, is fairly easy to procure. But if you think about what is the prototypical factory today, it's the Shenzhen Foxconn factory where they make iPhones. And if you have an iPhone or an Android phone, what you know is that these phones, these products that we carry on, are not made by the companies whose names are on them, right? They are made by hundreds of suppliers working in concert as a network, right? The world isn't dominated by single enterprises anymore. It's really run by business ecosystems, right? And so, but most ERP systems don't actually work that way, right? You know, business ecosystems are dynamic. They have network leaders, they have their own subsidiaries, they have business partners. It's really hard to keep track of who's working in your ecosystem over time, right? That's kind of how they work, right? And so if you're buying stuff from other people, it's hard to keep track of things like how much you bought or who spent it, because your network is constantly changing. And if you run your business as a network, you cannot run it from inside your own company's software systems. It's not possible, right? It's very, very difficult. And so we built a solution where networks of companies could transact with networks of companies. A lead buyer and a lead seller negotiate a deal, and we turn it into a digital smart contract. right? And that digital smart contract is accessible by an entire network on both sides of the equation, right? It's really that simple. It's a procurement system that's designed for networks of companies, not for individual enterprises, right? Now, do we have some idea of how well this works? Well, we have not yet implemented it. We just announced it last month, but we do have another customer that we did similar work for that we can start to get some understanding of the ROI, the return on investment, right? And I believe, okay, and I'm flattering myself because I made this chart, but I believe this is a good way to explain return on investment, right? We are building for Microsoft the software video game licensing system for the Xbox network, right? And it is now up and running. It's being deployed, and we have some good data now, right? So some of our data says, number one, we can do end of month statements or transaction statements in far less time than before, 99% less time, right? Faster, usually better. We think it will cost, even by the time we've invested all the money to build the system out, about half of what their present system costs. And we believe we'll put an end to litigation and fighting between participants who claim that they weren't treated fairly, because it will be very clear how the system operates. All right, let me wrap up here so that we can have time for some questions or some awkward silence if there are no questions. First of all, I just want to share with you, I talked about a couple of things that are available from, that we have contributed to that are freely available. If you want to use the tests, the ERC20 testing system that we created, visit blockchain.ey.com, sign up, log in. I apologize in advance if you're coming from a country where we are not able to offer this service. We are rolling out local servers, but we aren't everywhere yet. Secondly, Nightfall and Nightlight. This is our privacy software. It's available at github.com. And then finally, the details on the baseline protocol are available at thebaselineprotocol.org, because not only did we donate that software to the public domain, but we also handed over all of that to a foundation in cooperation with Consensus and Microsoft. All right, what does the future hold? I believe the most exciting thing that's happened over the last year is the rise of DeFi, decentralized finance. And DeFi is awesome because it sort of allows us to think of money as a Lego, right? And if I have this Lego, I can do other things with it. If I have an asset, I can borrow against it, I can loan it, I can send it to you. It's very powerful and useful. But if I think that there's a problem with blockchain today, it's that there's too many financial services and not enough other services, right? There's a lot of money chasing other money, tokens being sold for tokens, but they don't necessarily drive into the real economy. And I believe that the big opportunity in the future, what's going to shape things up, is a transition of blockchain to a connection with the real world. Now, this is a traditional supply chain framework: buy, make, move, store, and sell. It's super simplified, but it pretty much explains how stuff gets to you, right? One of my funnest conversations with my youngest son a few years ago was explaining to him where his hoodie came from, because it said made in Malaysia, right? Companies buy stuff, they buy raw materials, they make it into product, they move it, they store it in warehouses, and they sell it to you. DeFi has a role in all of those, right? If I have a purchase order from a big company, I can get working capital against it, right? If I have inventory, I can borrow money. If I have an invoice, I can get paid quickly, right? DeFi provides financial services across that chain. Should we also have decentralized systems? Do I really need to have all of these systems inside my own four walls when I run my business actually as a network of companies, right? We've started at EY with procurement, but there's manufacturing, logistics, replenishment planning, sales agreements. There's a whole set of tools and services that can be built into a global blockchain network. And finally, we should be connecting these things with decentralized operations. Got a 3D printer? You should be able to get in the manufacturing business, right? Air freight, warehousing, product distribution. These are all things that can be tokenized, standardized, and deployed to companies, right? And you should decide, what are you going to do well? If you are an amazing product designer, you should be able to design product and then pick those Legos, right? I want to buy raw materials from this guy, and I want it manufactured there, and then I want it shipped by air freight, and I want to get financing from my distributor, and when I get paid, I want to get paid early. right? You should be able to pick out those Legos from decentralized operations, systems, and finance to run your business, and it should be easy. You should not need a PhD in computer science to plug together all of these systems. They should snap together like Legos. And that, I believe, is what the future is. And it will trigger, I think, a wave of innovation and adoption, because it will make it easy for people to just do one thing really, really well and let the system do lots of other things. Now, if you're really, really good at warehousing, you should be offering your products in this decentralized environment because you can make them available to everybody. But the future, I believe, is the composable enterprise, where you pick the things you are good at, you do them extremely well, and you let the network take care of everything else. Are you tired? I am. It's Sunday morning here. I feel like I've had way too much coffee. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch up the presentation, and we'll either take questions or have 10 minutes of awkward silence before the next meeting.
Thank you, Paul. All right, so let me see if I even have my video on right now. And I do. All right. Okay. Can you see me? Actually, I cannot see myself.
I think you have to unspotlight me.
All right, probably. Okay, cancel the spotlight. Okay, there you go. Now I'm the spotlight. Thank you, Paul, for this amazing presentation. I myself learned so much. Yeah, I had no idea that Ernst & Young doing like that much in this area. So, and companies actually can use this product right now. We have some of the questions from our audience. We are streaming on the multiple live streams, so we are collecting, our team, thank you so much for collecting all these questions from different live streams. So the question that I see, can you estimate, you showed the adoption curve in your presentation. Will you be able to estimate for people how like, what is it in the years and months, this, because they probably need to know how late it is to get in and when they should get in, and should they still wait for some time? So is there any estimate, like let's say that you should get in the next 30 days and then it will be too late or something like that?
Yeah, it's not a 30-day thing. You know, I think we're very close to the inflection point. So we're within a year or two, because I think we're maturing incredibly quickly in this space. From the inflection point to the end is probably another, I would say, 15 years or so. Right. In consumer technology, we all went from not having smartphones to having smartphones in about 10 years, but consumers are faster decision makers. My guess is total time for enterprise adoption is closer to 25 years because of all the joyful committees that enterprises have and things like that. That 14,000 word license agreement that you clicked OK on, the lawyers are going to sit and read that. So it will take time, right? I think the time that's precious right now is if you want to be a market leader in blockchain, I think you have a couple of years at most before the market leaders become sort of fixed and dominant.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer in that one. Another question, in your view, where the blockchain development should be focused over the next couple of years to improve technology and increase its adoption?
So I think there's multiple dimensions, right? If I think about what we're focused on, it's number one, privacy, right? Enterprises simply will not transact without privacy. So that's kind of job number one. And we're in a really tough phase because privacy for tokens turns out to be relatively easy, but privacy for business logic turns out to be quite challenging. And so that's going to be kind of, I think that's where our R&D people are focused the most. The second thing is zeroing in on the use cases that really create value. And I'll give you a good example about the network procurement one. There are lots and lots of systems out there that are great for RFPs and RFQs and arranging bidding. But it turns out that there are almost no systems out there that are designed for ongoing execution. And the toughest thing about selling into an enterprise technology landscape is figuring out where the gaps are. Because you can go, and a really good example of all of the business ideas that have failed in the world of blockchain are this like money transfer thing, right? Yes, blockchain could be better than traditional money transfer services. But what you're missing is, both for consumers and enterprises, a principle that I call ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Just because something doesn't work well or amazingly or very good doesn't mean that people are going to ditch it in favor of something that's newer, right? We have this concept of path dependency. It's why Americans still write paper checks and other things like that, because a technology once established gets built into people's daily lives and their business processes, and it's very hard to unseat. And so if you want success with adoption, you need to pick the things that are really broken or not served at all to get started, I believe.
Thank you. Another question, what Ernst & Young will be focusing on in the next couple of years? Aside from supply chain use case, which use case are you excited the most? It's actually two questions.
The use case I am most excited about is the one I told you about, which is network procurement. I think it's incredibly broken. Every single company buys stuff from other companies, and most companies are part of some kind of business ecosystem. So I am extremely excited about that. I'm very excited about our security tool. It's relatively new, but I think fundamentally, the analogy I always use is this: if you're a company and you're buying laptops for your employees, you would never deploy those laptops without antivirus or security software. Well, if we believe in the future where every company does business on a blockchain, you would never enter into a digital smart contract without doing some kind of security test on it, right? And what I especially like about our security test, what gets me excited about it, is you do not have to be a software developer to understand the results, right? It's somewhat complex now. We're going to work on further simplifying it. But if you're a procurement executive, you should be able to look at the contract and say, does it or does it not comply with the standards that I agreed upon? And does it or does it not have major security flaws, right? And you should be able to answer, yes, it complies with the standards we agree upon, and no, it doesn't have major known security flaws. And I believe our solution will sell to developers, but I also believe it will sell to the non-developer types who would like to make sure, if not guaranteed, at least do proper due diligence before they sign a digital contract.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Another question, why did you choose Ethereum network for development? Why did you choose development on Ethereum network? And are you doing any support of ecosystem other than Ethereum?
So we do support non-Ethereum blockchains for audit and tax, but we only do our development on the Ethereum ecosystem. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. Number one, I believe we cannot make great software by making great software on 20 different platforms. It's very difficult, right? I believe we've built some of the world's greatest Ethereum developers by being laser focused on Ethereum. Now, if you want to build great software and you want to focus on only one platform to do it, you need to pick the one with the most developers, right? And by the way, I refuse to get sucked into these stupid discussions about which blockchain is better. I am not interested. And by the way, in the history of the universe, the best technology has never ever won. I don't know if it existed, but maybe there was something better than the wheel. And some poor inventor's like, my thing didn't work. Everybody's using the wheel, right? No matter what it is, Windows, iOS, Betamax, DVD players, doesn't matter what it was never the best technology, right? But the one that had the most users and the most developers always won. And so very ruthlessly, we picked Ethereum because it's the biggest ecosystem, and it's that simple.
Thank you. And I have a question from one of the attendees who actually right now here in Zoom. We have some of the attendees that joined us, donated money to Prize Fund and joined us in Zoom. Juliana, can you please ask your question, the one that you have?
Yeah, sure. My name is Eylon Aviv. Paul, I want to thank you very much for this great presentation. And it's like diverse lection actually today in this really geek world. Feels like a bit of session in a world market area. So it's microfinance and blockchain connection. Thank you. And my question is, yeah, blockchain now, that's more money transferable things, and everybody, companies and peers, so B2B, P2P, and totally whole system want to have more deep connections and functionality, of course, in terms of financial analytics and technical abilities. Could you just a little bit say more about Baseline protocol you mentioned? So that's something between like big ecosystems, or that's a commercial component of business relationship between enterprises. And is it software, or that's more than that?
It's a set of software tools. The Baseline protocol is a set of software tools that run in the Ethereum ecosystem and is designed to help you create secure private transactions between enterprises, right? And it was designed and built with a couple of really important thoughts in mind. Number one, private transfers work very well, but we had to think about private business logic, right? How do I make sure that the terms and conditions of the contract between you and I also don't become public information? Because that's as sensitive as the price I'm paying, right? How I'm paying you, or how much you're ordering, and things like that. So the name Baseline Protocol actually came from this idea that if there are 2 or 3 people in a deal, and we are transacting together, we all need to start from the same baseline, right? We all need to start from the same point and stay in sync as we move forward. And we use the blockchain to do that. So the goal is to use blockchain technology to support more complex but private interactions. And it's not a blockchain. It's not really a separate system. It's a set of tools that people can use to try to build more sophisticated but very private applications.
Thank you so much for answering these questions. I believe this is all time that we had for this presentation. Thank you so much, Paul. The recording will be available, and we will forward you the link of this recording. We are moving on to our next presenter.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Paul. We're moving on to our next presenter, our friend and our sponsor as well. Actually coming back, recurrent sponsor. Thank you so much, Stani, for doing that. Stanny Kuleshov, he is a CEO of AAVE. So Stani, and he's a founder also. AAVE is an open source and non-custodial money market protocol to earn interest on deposits and borrow assets. Stani was studying law at the University of Helsinki when he first got into the Ethereum, and he started exploring how it could impact the traditional financial system. In 2017, Stani released ETHLand, one of the first DeFi is a decentralized finance for our non-blockchain audience, decentralized finance DApps ever. And DApps this is also a decentralized applications. Since then, he was made it in his mission to create tools for an open, transparent, and equitable financial ecosystem through AAVE protocol. Stani was introduced to us, and we came across him last year, and since then Stani and AAVE made such a tremendous progress. Welcome, Stani, to our show, to our opening ceremony. Thank you, and tell me if I have you unmuted. Maybe I'm not. There you go. Now you are there.
Right. Thank you, Elena, for the introduction, and it's very nice to be here. Last year was really eye-opening, and I saw basically what kind of hacks can be done, and that was something very interesting. And I really liked the last year agenda and what kind of effort everyone put into the hackathon, and it really kind of was a good reminder for myself that actually it really doesn't make any difference like what kind of background you are or which part of the world you come from. I mean, I'm not a technical person. I used to be. I did programming in my teen years, but went more into law and saw kind of like interesting use cases for blockchain, and especially like the Ethereum ecosystem And I was amazed about the ecosystem and how much people were excited about building open source software. And basically, I come from very small country from Finland, which is in the Nordics, pretty cold as well. But that just shows kind of like how you could build very big things without actually being in the very spotlight. So that's like very cool thing what the technology evolves and the composability. Now, today, definitely, I'm going to now present a small slideshow about what kind of things are very important today in terms of like the situation what we have with the COVID, and also how finance is affecting from that, and also like taking a bit of look on the financial problems that we have globally now. And as we know that different financial problems, they occur in the different parts of the world. They might be because of politics, bad governance, or just because something changes, and or we have a similar situation that we have a virus spreading, and measures has to be taken, and then the economy suffers. Now, we're going to go into a bit more detailed on how actually decentralized finance could help to sort out things like that and mitigate kind of like that, improve finance in general. And I like to call it like future of finance, and that's what the my presentation today will be. You all see my shares, right? Okay, great. So yeah, the topic is basically building the future of finance, and why it's pretty much like I believe in the fact that the finance is changing is pretty much because like we are entering toward, especially like what decentralized finance is showing us, is that you don't anymore need a central access point to finance, and now you can actually participate to this financial network anywhere of the world, basically. And also it provides transparent ecosystem, and also auditable and seen by everyone. So all this kind of like a net or this kind of like shades that you have in traditional finance, they basically disappear, and you suddenly see everything that's happening in terms of finance. It's not that great for privacy, but I guess it's kind of like a first step forward, and privacy can build on top. But going forward, this is a good example of just like economies that are really broken at this point. So there is a financial kind of like a difficulty in Lebanon, where in the current moment, basically the Lebanese government is pretty much out of funds, and also the inflation in Lebanon is going very hard, and it's very difficult to get finance there on the government level. And most of the banks have been lending out to the Lebanese government. And what actually happened in that case is that those investments turn out to be very bad and poorly managed. And what is happening now is that the economy is collapsing in a way that the local currency is pretty much, which I believe is Lebanese pounds, or might be even lira that they use the naming. It's halving in terms of value. And what it basically means that all the Lebanese that are storing their value in their local currency in banks, their savings is basically melting down. And it's very hard to imagine the situation if you come from a developed country in terms of when you are living in an economy where you have fairly stable currency, and you have been saving for you have your life savings that you're accumulating, and it's kind of like as a situation it's very unfortunate and destroying quite a lot of the economy there. And one of the measures that the banks are doing, they're freezing accounts and funds. So normal people, they can't withdraw the funds out of their bank accounts. So basically to avoid the bank runs and conversion to other currencies, to basically stop further loss of the value of the Lebanese currency. Now, this is like interesting scenario because in one way they are stopping the currency going even further bad. But on the other hand, what they're doing is they're restricting people from actually losing those life savings and whatever they have built because of the poor management of the investments of the banks and the government. And that's like a kind of like a very problematic situation. And also like when you have currency that is going down and you can't convert it to anything else, what actually it means is that it takes you a lot of value to, well, actually a lot of nodes of that currency to buy something, and that makes basically people very poor because the prices are very, very high. And similarly, these kind of like economic problems, they're not just related to between banks and for example the consumers, which is like the very biggest problems. If consumers can't actually perform finance and make financial decisions and have savings and put that money back into the ecosystem or with the economy will not function. But also it's basically the kind of like a custody issue that we have in the traditional finance. It also exists between nations and governments. And this is pretty interesting recent case where the Venezuela, their government stores gold in the vaults of Bank of England, which is the central bank of England, and at the current state, Venezuela is in the position that they actually don't have enough, for example, resources to fuel and warm the country and have basically sufficient power, even though it's a country with vast oil reserves. So the situation is very difficult, and because of the COVID, what actually happens is that the situation is even worse. And in one way, what Venezuela is now doing is asking their own gold back from the Bank of England, and to be able to actually mitigate those measures. So they're trying to avoid the COVID to spread. Of course, there's a bit of politics involved, whether that's true or not. But the interesting point here is that the British government, along with 60 other countries worldwide, do not recognize Maduro as a legitimate leader in Venezuela, and there's different kinds of allegations and so forth. So they can't withdraw the gold that their own gold that they actually deposited into the Bank of England. So this is like highlights the interesting like problem and kind of like the value proposition that decentralized finance has. So the idea of decentralized finance, amongst other things, is to avoid the kind of like a custody issue by being able to interact with different protocols and store value without losing your custody, and making like finance very efficient and more secure in that way. And kind of that will allow to remove the politics out of money, which might be very important to people, as almost as important as being as a human right to basically possess economic funds. What's interesting, like if you go a couple of years back into Venezuela again, like there has been, when the economy was going quite heavily down, one of the interesting things what happened is that the banknotes, the local currency, Bolivar, basically lost its value in a very hyperinflation manner, which means that if today you go into a store and buy a basically let's say bread, it takes you a couple of bricks of banknotes, and tomorrow you have to bring more than 2, maybe 4 or 5 bricks of banknotes of the local currency, which makes the system very unstable. And similar as in Lebanon, the situation where actually you lose your life savings, whatever you had saved in that currency, because of the rise of the prices. And that's kind of like a very difficult scenario. So what happened is that basically in Venezuela, they started to realize that actually you could eggs are they have very valuable use case, and like we're talking about the eggs of the the chicken. So that's very interesting here. That basically, as the government had the local currency, and basically you don't have any more trust in that local ecosystem, or let's say local economy, or the government's ability to handle it, and part of that handling is basically printing money and so forth. So what was interesting, what happened is that it's kind of like an egg economy started to rise a bit. So there was job placements where you got the salary, and plus part of the salary is also eggs of the chicken. And also there were small shops that were accepting more preferred to take eggs as a currency than the local banknotes. And what's interesting here, like when we look at the egg as a payment or as a currency, is that it's pretty actually decentralized compared to national currencies, because basically to create more eggs, you need a chicken. So if you have a chicken, you basically can mint more of that currency and those eggs. And also basically when you mint those eggs, they have actually a very good utility, because it's energy. You can basically eat it. You can feed animals with it, and God knows what you can do in the future in terms of chicken eggs. And that's like a good example, like how despite of the fact that the economy is collapsing and the governments aren't handling things well, innovation takes place. It's a very simple innovation in terms of like there's no blockchain technology here. It's just basically a currency that is based on commodity, which is the eggs. But this shows that even like in the worst and worst scenario that people are going into, in a very desperate positions, there's innovation. People are trying to survive, and I think like that's the kind of like a goal of this hackathon as well. Like the idea is basically to see, like, even if you have like a situation which is very bad, I mean, there's always a solution and always things that could be innovated upon that. And one of the key points here is that if there is innovation, other peoples are willing to adopt that. And in this case, with the egg economy, what is interesting is that basically you will not have the economy if other people will not start to kind of like adopt and take those eggs as a payment method. So that's like a good sign and a good example of actually like how things could even like be innovated, even in a very worst case scenario. Now, those are very like hardcore scenarios where the economy is pretty much collapsing, and there's other examples, for example, Cyprus, Greece, and Argentina, and so forth, and Turkey as well, where there has been issues with the economy and with the currency and the political stability. And I am pretty sure that in the future there will be more of this kind of scenarios. Now, in the world that we're living, like if you think how this all is basically possible, well, what's interesting in the Lebanese scenario or any national currencies, it's usually based on the local economy. And if people don't trust the local economy, or the foreign investment isn't trusting or investing, or there's restrictions to invest, it's very difficult to spin that economy back into the from that situation. And what's interesting about US dollar is that it's pretty much a currency that is used beyond the US economy in global trading. So it makes it a bit more something that the market participants trust more into it. And of course, when banks control the custody of the funds and can apply the freezing and hold the funds as storage, it's very difficult system, and that's why you have this scenarios that basically people can't do anything, where they're watching their savings basically melt. And of course, access to lending market is pretty much a political game. So even if there is global lending markets, International Monetary Fund and all the international organization, and just the actual commercial markets, it's heavily involved in politics, and basically that depends on how you can access and to what price into the money. And this is a issue as well. And the egg economy is pretty interesting example on how people will keep innovating and finding solutions. And that's something I'm hoping from this hackathon as well, in terms of like how you could use DeFi in the solving these big issues. And in general, what we're doing in AAVE protocol is that we have a global lending market, which means that you can, the users on Ethereum, they basically can deposit different kinds of assets and they earn interest on those assets. And then there's counterparties that are borrowing those assets against a collateral. So AAVE protocol is something that evolved from our very first lending product, ETH, which was the first lending protocol on Ethereum. We launched it a couple of years ago and basically modeled into this pool style money markets. And what is interesting about this and in DeFi general is that kind of like we provide the access to the decentralized finance. So decentralized finance is pretty much non-custodial finance. So anyone who participates it has a kind of like a censorship resistant access. So you can access it to any parts of the board. Of course, there's like still issues with regulation because it's very gray area at the moment, but it's an interesting movement that we have. And of course, like it's permissionless money. So in other words, you don't need to ask anyone's permission to move the money around. And also, if you interact with different kinds of protocols, smart contract protocols, calling the functions, and basically you are able to understand what's there. And hopefully in the future, larger audience, the consumers are able to understand in a non-technical way. It pretty much allows you to interact without giving up this custody and without having permissions to interact with the protocols. And one of the interesting things is that these money markets and the whole DeFi space is basically auditable by anyone. And I'm pretty like much advocate also for privacy. And in terms of like financial privacy, I think it's very, very, very important to have it. But I think we're living in a step in Ethereum ecosystem or the whole like DeFi thing is that we pretty much need the auditability at this point because we need to see what things are happening, how people are building and using DeFi, and also kind of like from the risk perspective as well. And I think privacy is something that will be built on top of the DeFi protocols, and that's something that will also give more access to adoption. And of course, as it's programmable money, so anyone in even this hackathon, for example, they can program different kinds of smart contract activity interactions between other DeFi protocols, for example, with AAVE or, for example, with Uniswap, and create new financial products that might help other people. And of course, like one of the things with the DeFi is that it's kind of like, even when we say that DeFi or Ether is basically a bit of like a programmable money, like it should happen on the back end. Like there was an interesting tweet about J.K. Rowling asking about like what's Bitcoin, and when people were explaining, and I tried to explain that it's basically something that you can program. I mean the Ether, and pretty much like this, her tweet shows quite well the example like how things should be simple for the front end users and the wider audience. So that's something that when you build things, you should keep in mind. Yeah, some things that you can actually, these are a couple of examples that you can actually build during this hackathon or just use as an inspiration on how you could use like DeFi and AAVE protocol in building basically a better, like a better finance in different parts of the world. One is, for example, just a global savings account. So when you deposit into AAVE protocol, you get in return a interest-bearing A token. So one DAI is one A DAI. And the cool part is that when your interest is accumulating in the protocol, it's credited directly algorithmically into your address. So you will see your A DAI balance growing. So what you actually have here is basically a interest-bearing token, which is kind of like an interest-bearing savings account that mitigates the inflation, and it's at the same time automated treasury management. Now, what is interesting about this particular kind of like idea is that anyone who holds A DAI, any parts of the board, basically has a savings account. Now, if you're in this position and you're at the current state in Lebanon, or you might be in Venezuela or Turkey, having that kind of account, even though it's dollar nominated, it has dollar inflation and the interest rates is fighting against it. It's a very big opportunity. And also, when you are sending the ADI as a payment from one person to another, the interest still keeps growing, which basically means that in the whole cycle of payments, the ADI basically fights against inflation and manages treasury basically interest automatically. So that's like very cool thing. And one of the ideas basically could be in this hackathon, how could you easily convert eggs or just banknotes into A tokens, any part of the world globally, which basically means that anyone with a Ethereum address could actually be able to obtain a savings account anywhere in the world, and basically with a global savings rates, which basically is the decentralized finance. And it's small still, but it's still growing and pretty auditable market. So that's something very, very cool thing you could do. One interesting stuff is that we always talk about like DeFi as a because of the over collateralization, that it only serves people with wealth, right? Well, I think it's kind of right, but it's pretty much mimics the whole financial ecosystem that we have now. So basically, there is so much trust and value in terms of like what banks are doing between each other. And by value and trust, I mean that how much they can print money. Well, instead of printing money, what we do in DeFi is that we collateralize different kinds of obligations. And what's interesting here, without going into details, is that when I deposit into AAVE, for example, Ether, I will get a credit line, so I can borrow stable coins. And what's interesting, like you can expand the current like DeFi nature, like in a wider adoption, if basically instead of you drawing that credit line, you basically let someone, your friend or someone from your community, whatever is your community, or you find a place where there's a deficit or lack of access to finance, and go there and make an ecosystem where you can actually delegate to other people the credit. So instead of me drawing that credit line out, I would just make an agreement with someone else that could draw the credit line. That can be my friend, or that can be my DAO members in a DAO that I am, or that can be basically credit line to you, and you're re-lending to a community somewhere in some part of the board. So that's like pretty cool stuff. Like this has very big impact if it's done like interesting way in places where there's really lack of finance, because with this thing you can actually borrow liquidity from DeFi, like in this global pool, into different parts of where there's lack of liquidity. Yeah, so what's interesting is that where you can create this trust network, could it be your friends, could it be a community, a village somewhere in the world, or community that just doesn't have any kind of banking infrastructure. So that's interesting thing that you can think about. And if you think about like where help is needed at this point, this is the map of like current cases of COVID in different parts of the world, like the cumulative numbers. So I think like thinking about these economies, how you can prevent it spreading, and how their financial ecosystem will be affected, and how you could mitigate the damages of the financial ecosystem, that could be a pretty interesting help that you could build. And of course, there's the inflation in 2020. This map shows pretty well. It shows, for example, cases like Venezuela and Greece and even Thailand. But mind that basically there's blind spot where there's no data. So even if there's no data available, you should still kind of like try to find out if those areas can be solved. For example, Brazil here is a good example where this doesn't show the data from there. And this is from International Monetary Fund. And of course, different interest rate in different parts of the world. So basically, where I live in Finland, if I would go into a bank and take a loan, the interest rate might be below 1% or very close to zero. And if someone else goes to take a loan, for example, in India, it might be from 14 to 16%. In Brazil, it might be 20, 25, 28%, and so forth. And these are inflation adjusted prices. So with that credit delegation hack, you could actually hack those places and offer them more better credit with lower price and get more money into their ecosystem. So that's pretty interesting stuff. Yeah, besides that, AAVE team is basically 17 individuals working from different parts of the world. We're headquartered in London, and we have an office in Switzerland, but we work globally. And we are known as the Avengers. And if you have any questions, you can always jump into our Telegram. And yeah, and basically that's about it from my presentation.
Maybe we can ask some questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Some questions. We can hear you very, very faintly, Nataliya.
Yeah.
Still like very faintly.
A bit the same.
Yeah, maybe try without the headphones.
Oh, it's the same a bit, kind of like, well.
They gave her a new headset. It's okay now.
Well,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, so we're going to fix that. We're going to try to help Nataliya to fix that. In the meantime, if anybody have any questions, we have some questions from the audience. So Stani, what would you be like best advice for the people who will be going for your award for the AAVE Integration Awards? AAVE donated $2,000 towards the Integration Award. Thank you so much. What would be your best advice for people who is going for this award on how to win it and how to be the best?
Yeah, I think like one thing always to consider, like in hackathons, is basically it's not like a competition. So it's basically everyone who attends is one way or another already a winner, because it's kind of like a challenge that you're taking, and it's all about personal growth. In terms of like kind of like how to win that prize, I think what's interesting is that kind of one thing what we're looking is always like innovation, but how you could help people, because now the thing with DeFi is that it really serves like the collateralization economy. So how you could extend that and actually help people, like how you can use DeFi in a way that you can actually like make a lot of value added in the real world, and fixing finance, and also not just fixing finance, but helping people and places where you could actually scale it a lot. And kind of like that's very important. And second thing is kind of like if you're able to find blind spots and also kind of fill them, because we tend to find a lot of places where we can fix, but I think it's all about the young developers, young minds, and everyone that participates to find different problems in the economy or in the world and trying to fix those. It doesn't need to be the most biggest issue, but fixing something even small for a large audience of people might be very important, or even to small audience. So it's really what's important is innovation. And since you have good amount of time and it's not a 48 hours hackathon, you can put a lot of quality and effort on what you're doing. And of course, you need to enjoy what you're doing. So, I mean, respect your team members and try to build and enjoy and also kind of like have fun at the same time.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this answer. We have another question. DeFi aspires to democratize access to money and become an alternative to the legacy financial system. How do you overcome trust issues given the recent attacks on DeFi lending platforms?
Yeah, a very, very good question, because I mean, especially like what's very problematic for us, like for the developers, is that we have only limited time to develop protocols, and basically attackers, exploiters have unlimited time to actually attack. And I think those hacks that happen definitely like requires more diligence in terms of like to prevent this kind of things, but also it really strengthens the whole ecosystem, because if you take measures after something like that happens, for example, like now with the flash loan attacks that basically came out into the with the public, and there was multiple of them, like now we have to build basically flash loan resilient technology. And I think just the reputation always suffers because it puts people like a bit back, but also it teaches us to develop better technology, more simple technology. And I think that's what matters. I don't think like DeFi will die easily. I think in a contrary way that basically it has more tendencies to grow, but also it's our responsibility to kickstart an ecosystem and further like for the governance to ensure that it's basically safe and secure. So that's something that we are at AAVE putting a lot of effort now.
Thank you, Stani. I think this all that we have for this presentation. I would like you to thank you one more time for joining us today and also for sponsoring this event. We couldn't have done it without you again. Thank you very much. And we're moving on to our panel, to the long anticipated panel. So we are doing a panel today on the decentralized autonomous organizations, also known as the digital communities. Our hackathon is also organizing one, a digital community where we open up the decision-making and voting to all participants of this hackathon to actually select a winners. So they can basically, they can hack and then they can also vote for their own project, upvote their own project, but their voting power depends of how many sessions they attended, how much they participated, how many sponsors they brought, how many members of other communities they brought. So this all get accounted. This is our first experience doing that. We, of course, we found the challenges, but we're also very excited about this too. So this panel for us is very, very useful to listen to. So, and I would like to introduce the members of this panel, starting from Amber Scott. Amber is our moderator today, and I'm going to mute you guys just in a few seconds. Bear with me. So Amber, and she's also founder and chief AML ninja of Outlier Solutions. Our second panelist is Vitalik Buterin, who is founder and inventor of Ethereum. Third panelist is Nataliya Hearn. She is a director here at CryptoChicks, and she's leading our educational initiatives. Ben Goertzel, he is the Singularity Net CEO and also one of the inventors of Robot Sophia AI. Lucia Gallardo, she is our longtime friend and person and woman that we admire, her work we admire. She's the founder and CEO of Emerge. And Joel Telpner, who is also our friend, the chair of Sullivan FinTech and Blockchain Practice. So right now, this is our first time we're doing this panel. So I would like to ask the guests who are here in the Zoom and not participating in this panel, please stop your videos, and so we will have only panelists on the screen with the videos. Everybody else, so yes, we have our panelists. I will stop my video too in a moment. Great. All right, and I also unmute you all, guys. I'll ask to unmute. And actually, I have in the settings that you can unmute yourselves. So please feel free to try and mute yourselves and just try out your microphones. There are some challenges.
Yo.
Yes. Hi there.
Awesome.
Okay, we're sounding good, I think.
Yeah.
So, is my sound coming through okay?
Yes. It is.
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, I just wasn't lighting up on my screen, so I wasn't sure. So that's wonderful. I'm really excited about this panel. I think we have such a really great range of technologists, We have a lawyer who's a technologist, which I feel like I can never know enough of in my life. I think that everyone who's here is a true community builder. So this is going to be, I think, a really cool conversation. And I think that when we were talking about what we were going to, the questions that we were going to ask on a panel, Joel actually brought up a really interesting point, which is that no two projects are exactly the same in terms of their consideration. And since we're going to be talking about decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs, I wanted to start with a really general question, which is just pragmatically and technically, what is a DAO? And in this question and in all questions, I think it's okay if we approach it from a different perspective or have a little bit of disagreement. That keeps life fun.
And I guess there's a lot of things that you can call DAOs, right? Originally the concept was meant to be very broad. It was meant to be this kind of any kind of decentralized organization where kind of the code and the logic run or the rules that are running the organization aren't kind of controlled and managed in any one single place. They could be running on a chain, they could be running in some other kind of system between a lot of different different computers, could be a lot of things. And since then, we've seen a lot of projects that are trying to do DAOs in practice that tends to involve voting, and they tend to involve kind of people who have DAO tokens, and the DAO controls funds, it controls some resources, and they kind of vote on what the DAO does. And like that's one kind of DAO, but that's also not the only kind of DAO. Like I think there's many kinds of governance other than or even kind of going beyond just having simple votes. There's also kind of the question, is the DAO something that anyone can join? Is there some process approving who joins? So there's this kind of very large design space of things that you can do. And when I tried to classify things, like I wrote this blog post that goes on DAOs, DACs, and DAs about 4 or 5 years ago. The main kind of distinction that I made is basically that a DAO, as opposed to say just a decentralized application, is something that kind of tries to be persistent. So it's not just, a couple of people interact over here, then a couple of people interact over there. It's something that is a smart contract or something else, and kind of some system that kind of governs people interacting for a long time, and that system survives for a long time, where it kind of has continuity the same way that an organization does. And I mean, the difference between like what a DAO is and what a kind of DO without the autonomousness, and that's also kind of a gray area. I mean, I don't know, and that one's even hard to tell sometimes.
It's historically when people wanted to form or start some type of business, they'd come together and say, well, let's create some type of structure. Let's form a company, let's form a corporation, and then we can figure out who's going to do what in that corporation. We'll have this kind of legal entity around us that we use to launch and build our business. And what we've come to realize, especially with this technology, is you don't need to do that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, but you don't need to do that. You can use the technology itself to allow people to come together in whatever way, shape, and form they want to collectively pursue some type of business, some type of common goal. And that legal entity doesn't have to be there for people to be able to come together and do something, especially because the technology itself allows us to be able to collectively make decisions and vote and do things as a group without having that infrastructure, that old-fashioned infrastructure surrounding us if we don't want it. I
think also important to note maybe the evolution of digital communities or communities in general, and saying, the first question is who's going to make it up? Who's going to take place in this? The second question being, how is this going to be governed? And then the third question, which is what is new here and why we've sort of had this this resurgence of DAOs, I think, is the technological part. So how do we automate the first two questions? And I think that's the only reason why we're sort of seeing this resurge in such a forceful way. And it's really incredible to see sort of these communities pop up, but still a lot of questions. And I know we're going to dive into it, but still a lot of questions remain to be answered.
Yeah, I would like to dive a bit more into what is a DAO, which has been pointed out it's a subtle concept, right? So I mean decentralized organization is one point where, of course, a decentralized organization doesn't require any computing technology. A participatory democracy that just chooses the rules to govern a group of people by voting among those people without representatives or presidents. I mean, a group operating by participatory democracy where everyone votes on every law is a very decentralized organization. And I mean, it's autonomous in a sense, but it's not what we mean by a DAO. What we mean by a DAO is something that runs with computer software or hardware rather than people normally. So if we look at what do we mean by an autonomous organization in the sense of a DAO operating with smart contracts and such, we don't mean yet that the DAO can entirely operate in the human world without needing to summon up any human labor for anything. I mean that will happen. That will happen eventually. That's what we're looking forward to. And you saw in books like Accelerando and previous science fiction, right? You had a decentralized organization in the sense of a bunch of software and engineered hardware entities, and they're collaborating among each other to use resources to do things, and there are no biological organisms involved whatsoever. It's a sort of decentralized collective intelligence of engineered hardware and software entities. Now, the DAOs that we're talking about now are not yet that, because say they still need human beings to plug in the machine, and they still may need to hire a human lawyer to send a letter to stop someone from shutting off their power and so forth. So we're talking about decentralized autonomous organizations, which are collections of software programs with a largely decentralized mode of control, and that operate and do their business with a large amount of independence from the human world. So if I wanted to try to sum it up, I would say a DAO, as we're considering it now, it's a set of hardware, engineered hardware and software processes with a largely decentralized mode of control and coordination, and where you could say most of the sort of causal force, most of the causality in what they do lies in the machine network itself, rather than in whatever humans are summoned up to help the machine network do things, which is very different than, say, a typical corporation, which, you know, is a somewhat decentralized autonomous organization, but the machines there are acting mainly at the behest of the humans. Like, the humans arguably still have a lot of causal force in corporations, whereas in a DAO, the causal force is with the network of machines, and that can lead to all sorts of new modes for, you know, network effects and exponential growth. It's a very, very interesting concept, albeit a bit of a fuzzy one when you really dig into where the borders of the concept lie.
I like that. I think the more that we know about anything, the more that there's gray areas as opposed to absolutes. So it's interesting to see that reflected in the answers. One of the things that I think is a fairly important question, and Ben, I think you led into it brilliantly, is I've heard people often, even that are pretty advanced in the AI space and in the blockchain space, talk about things like you can't solve governance with technology. And so my question is, what are the problems that we can solve well with technology right now, and what are the places where that human intervention is more required, or to summon human labor, as you so eloquently phrased it?
I don't know of any human problem that can be solved purely with technology, because any technology that you release could be used in some perverted way by people if they want to. Like, I mean, you could look at, say, the control of the technology of birth control solves some problems, arguably very, very elegantly, of stopping unwanted pregnancies. But of course, an oppressive society could use birth control in a horrible fascist way rather than a progressive and positive way. So to me, as long as humans are the nexus of causal power and are basically in control of society, which is probably the case at least for the next few years, I don't know. I mean, then any technology doesn't solve a problem entirely, because people can always find some way to use that technology in a horrible way or in a great way. And of course, blockchain, you can see the same way. Some governments are using blockchain to enforce very detailed, centralized authoritarian control, whereas other oligopolies are using it just to rip people off, and some folks are using it in the more anarcho-libertarian vein in which it was conceived by more of the early advocates.
I think there's a lot we've gotten right and wrong in terms of how we've gone about developing technology. It is, after all, a tool, and so it does need to account for, you know, we've done a lot in artificial intelligence and within other forms of technology and blockchain primarily to look at incentives and look at human behavior as an action. But we still have yet to really figure out these ways in which we can tap into these like notions of human nature that relate to community building and social behavior and things like that. And so I think like Ben hit the nail on the head with that. There's components that can be solved through technology. Technology is ultimately, however, just a tool to enable sort of human nature to express itself, right? So there's still a long way to go in terms of how we are able to build better tools to tap into this component.
Yeah, there's definitely like some things that even say in the existing Ethereum ecosystem that run autonomously. So like Uniswap runs autonomously, for example, Tornado Cash runs autonomously. There's some scaling systems can run autonomously. The general kind of distinction that you can see is that when you can define the behavior of the system kind of fully programmatically, when you can kind of define what the system is supposed to do using a kind of static formula, which is true sometimes, but it's definitely not true anywhere close to the majority of the time, then you can create this kind of static automaton that's just a piece of code and people interact with it. And you know, it's decentralized, it's autonomous. It's hard to even decide whether or not it's an organization. Like, is Uniswap an organization? Is someone who goes on to Uniswap and trades some ETH for DAI at 11 a.m. really kind of organizing with someone who goes on and buys some DAI for ETH at 2 p.m.? I don't know. It doesn't really seem that way. But if you start going toward anything kind of more complex, where the goals of what the thing is trying to do kind of can't be described using a static algorithm in that way, that's when you start needing a governance of some kind, right? And the simplest example is even like something like a price feed, for example, right? Like if you want to have a stable coin, so something like Maker, DAI, or UMA, or some of the newer ones, then you need to have some way of kind of in the protocol knowing what the price of a token is. And the problem is that the price of one asset relative to the US dollar or any other kind of asset that doesn't exist inside of the chain is not something that you can determine programmatically, right? It's something that's, you have to kind of go out and look into the real world, and then there might be edge cases, and what happens if, taking even the extreme case, like the US splits in half, and now there's two entities that are claiming to be the government and claiming to be the issuer of the US dollar. Like even just something as simple as kind of providing a price feed, right? Or on the other side, like what if the chain hard forks and people disagree on what Ether is? So even like in those kinds of situations, there's always these gray areas that exist. And another example might even be like, what if a bunch of exchanges crash at the same time? When you have the possibility that those situations exist, you have to have like some kind of human intervention and some kind of subjective definition of, or kind of intuitive definition of, what are we trying to capture by the concept of like the price of ETH in US dollars? And that becomes harder, and that actually ends up needing something that's in some ways almost as complicated as kind of full governance for a lot of other applications. And then if you're not just trying to gather data and you're trying to make decisions, then decisions are even more subjective, and so it becomes kind of even more complicated after that.
I think fundamentally we also have generally a distrust with technology, because somebody created that technology, right? So do we trust the people who created it? And then do we also how do we implement that technology? And do we trust the implementation? So there's like that natural DAO that we all kind of live in. And I think maybe, planet Earth is fundamentally our DAO because we breathe one air, right? But we're kind of stuck in that DAO. And then there's DAOs that we choose to be in. So I think it's an interesting, it becomes a philosophical discussion, and then we're kind of all entering into that, and a trust and our values, collective values.
So I think that both of those last answers touched on something that I tend to think of as the Oracle issue, but Ben talked about in his talk yesterday as being arbiters of truth. So what are the arbiters of truth within these systems? How do we get those things to make sense? And from a technology perspective, are you of the opinion that it makes sense to try to figure out better oracles at this point, or are we better off looking at systems that aren't reliant on oracles?
I definitely think we need better oracles, though I think it's not like creating better oracles isn't just a kind of mathematical technology question. It's also a social technology question, right? Because like ultimately you have to get inputs from the outside, and you have to kind of decide like basically which of these inputs represent the truth. And the information about which of those inputs represents the truth is not kind of mathematically analyzable. It's the kind of information that people have, and you have to aggregate it. And there's creating systems that don't rely on oracles, and it's nice if you can, but often there's just like a simple fact that you can't. And that's just something that you would have to accept. There's definitely ways that systems can use oracles less. And it turns out that if you use an oracle less, then the kind of the need for or the kinds of properties that you would need out of an oracle can be relaxed a bit. So making an oracle that gives answers occasionally is simpler than giving an oracle that has to give answers every 5 seconds. So you can go a little bit of the way, but like ultimately, if you want to access information from the outside world, there's definitely kind of fundamental difficulties that you do have to just kind of face head on, and you can't kind of completely dodge.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vitalik is correct. I mean, of course, we need better and better automated systems for sifting through all the chaos of true and fake knowledge out there, and you can see that in, say, therapies for COVID-19. So something I've been working on recently. I mean, there's loads of research papers, there's loads of reports out there, and having AI to summarize all those papers is valuable. Having AI openly looking at the data from the clinical trials, which is not currently being allowed, would be far more valuable. But I mean, in the end, I mean, why do we trust those oracles, right? I mean, unless it's a religious thing. I mean, in the end, it's a personal decision or a social network and reputation-based decision. Like I trust the oracle Vitalik posted more than the one Craig Wright posted or something, right? So I mean, you've got in the end there's a social network that tells us which oracle we want to believe, right? So I think we need both. We need better mechanisms for reputation management and for allowing people to indicate which humans and which machines they place faith in for what purposes and why. And we need better automated systems to sift through all the mess of knowledge, which is too much for any human brain to comprehend at this point.
But Ben, that's a great point you just raised, though. One of the benefits of a DAO is that as we continue to come up with better oracles, the community can collectively decide as to which oracles, at least for now, it's willing to agree to are the appropriate ones to look at. And so it allows us to at least collectively access the oracles that are there, whether or not they're perfect, but reach consensus that we're going to accept those oracles as the quote truth, at least for the period of time until we decide to replace them with something that's better.
Well, right. I mean, and right now we have that mix of social and technical assurance in all the open source code out there. Like, why do I trust that my Ethereum node isn't full of viruses that are going to hack my machine? I haven't actually read all the code of every version, but I know there's other people who have, who I trust, because other people I know trust them, and so forth. And that it's going to continue that way. I mean, until such a point as there's an AI 10,000 times smarter than all humans, and we have no choice but to place our trust in it, like the way my dog places a trust in me.
Actually, Ben, you brought something in your last talk about collective collaborative filtering. So there's that we're dealing with, plus the time factor, if we could summarize, because we need time to decide if this is working for us as a humanity or not.
Yeah, I mean, active collaborative filtering as a technology area is certainly a key part of it. And basically what that means is that people, not only implicitly by what they look at, are they expressing an opinion on it, people are explicitly rating in some way, this is bad in this way, this is good in this way, and then this knowledge propagates. And of course, Twitter has recently done that to some of President Trump's pronouncements, which has caused some controversy. But of course, the problem isn't that Twitter is doing active filtering on Trump. The problem is, like, why does this centralized organization, Twitter, have so much power in the first place? I mean, let alone the question of why Trump has so much power in the first place. I mean, we should all be expressing our view on the information that comes into us and propagating that view to others. And this should be fed into machine learning algorithms that are operating in a transparent way. And, you know, given the modes of organization on the planet right now, meaning governments, corporations, and whatnot, you know, having decentralized autonomous organizations mediate the active collaborative filtering and leveraging machine learning to transparently facilitate assignation of reputation to human and automated sources. I mean, we should be having DAOs that regulate this information filtering process, right? And these DAOs would be coded using open source code and operating in a transparent way. And this will be, of course, far better than having centralized for-profit corporations whose motive centrally has to be to maximize shareholder value, to having that do the filtering of the insane ramblings of the leader of the free world.
Also interesting what you bring up in terms of these checks and balances, specifically because of this notion of tyranny of majority, right? So just because you do have consensus forming within a community or within a DAO, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is inherently like the best or right outcome. And so I'd be curious to see how a platform, you know, that could exist parallel to Twitter, that does operate in this governance mechanism would work, in essence, combating these notions of, you know, sometimes the majority isn't right.
Yeah, there's multiple layers here, right?
Yeah.
Because you can design a reputation and rating system that bypasses the problem of tyranny of the majority. And I mean, our Singularity Net weighted liquid rank reputation system does that. On the other hand, I mean, someone has to decide to put such a reputation system in place in the first place, right? Like if the majority votes against a fair and balanced reputation system, then you won't have it. And here my personal inclination is to default to a sort of anarcho-libertarianism. Like I would rather not have any government at the top, like telling which DAOs you're allowed to join, right? I would rather view it as a sort of network of overlapping DAOs and agents, like humans or machines, with the ability to join the DAOs that they want. So then I can join a DAO that isn't plagued with tyranny of the majority problems. And if some people like having dictators or oligarchs, they can join a DAO that has a tyranny of the majority or a tyranny of one guy problem, right? But again, what you see here is you can't really separate the technology or the logic of voting and governance from the underlying sort of human collective behavior and collective psychology problem, that they all tangle up with each other in a quite fascinating and complex way.
It doesn't seem realistic really to get there, but on the other hand, you know, it doesn't seem realistic that the whole world would come to an agreement to shut down. So maybe we're closer to that than we think we are, you know?
Well, the election of President Trump indicates that people have been very poor at estimating what is realistic.
I'm excited by what this door has opened us into. I completely agree with that.
So let me jump from there into just a question of participation, because I think it's an interesting segue into that. And this is something that came up in both Ben and Vitalik's talks yesterday. Vitalik, you talked a little bit about how governance is so much more complex than voting. And Ben dived a little bit into the idea that interest is really required for even something as simple as voting. So people have to be interested. People have to be incented in some way to participate or willing in some way to participate. But even when we're outside of all of the access to technology and ability to use technology effectively type of questions, in some cases, we have things like really low voter turnout, even in traditional, putting pen to paper, adding a check mark to a box type of questions. And so what makes sense in terms of having a more participative type of function in a DAO?
I think, so first of all, kind of, we have this, I think, kind of binary between two different decision-making mechanisms, where one decision-making mechanism is kind of each one person has a kind of close to basically an absolute domain over some particular thing. So, you have close to an absolute domain over your private property. If you own a company, you have close to an absolute domain over it. And on the other extreme, you have kind of voting, where people vote on kind of decisions that affect pretty much everyone, and it's kind of flat, right? Everyone's expected to, or kind of at least implicitly, kind of equally care about every decision. And there's this kind of space in the middle that we haven't really explored all that much, right? Because there's a lot of kind of things that we have to decide on, a lot of kind of public matters that we want to participate in, and where we have good information that we should be expressing, but where at the same time the scope isn't kind of this kind of big flat scope where everyone is equally affected and everyone should have an equal say, right? So there's issues that affect kind of small groups of people. There's issues that affect some people more than other people. And like, this is one of the things that quadratic voting and quadratic funding, for example, that I'm a big fan of, is trying to solve, right? Like, basically come up with mechanisms that actually let people kind of differently signal their strength of preference or their strength of opinion on some particular issue, and actually kind of concentrate their voice on areas that matters more to them. And at least in the kind of experiments that we've tried with Gitcoin grants, like, it seems to actually have kind of very positive results in that regard, right? It seems to kind of make people actually respond better to environments where they do have the ability to kind of express their say on a wider variety of issues and kind of choose what matters more to them, as opposed to just like basically picking Team Red or Team Blue once in a while. So I think kind of experimenting on mechanisms that kind of go beyond those binaries is something that I think has a lot of very positive potential.
Amber, I think you touched on something really interesting, which is that this is a tendency that's not just found within DAOs, it's found just like societally. We have an overall lack of participation. And I think I've been spending a lot of time recently focused a lot on fear of the unknown, and just making certain that I understand how displacement might feel, or exclusion from a system might feel. And so if you have people that are afraid of a system that sounds like it's disrupting what they have known all their lives, even if they're not happy with what they've known all their lives, there's a fear factor in sort of participating in systems that they don't quite understand yet, and or that they might not be able to get advantage or feel like they're in an advantageous position within. And so I think, number one, it's this fear factor. And even if the system has never been working for you, this notion of, I'm going to call it an American dream syndrome, where, you know, you think that if you work hard enough, or if you learn it, or if you like start to understand it, then somehow you might be able to sort of capture it and you know, finally reap the benefits of the system. There's this notion that, like, at least I'm working towards that. And here comes something else that's saying, well, now I'm totally going to destroy you know, what you think you've known is a good system or a system that functions in order to keep order, and we're saying we're going to run things a different way. And so I think there's this like fundamental fear of really diving into something that is unknown and ununderstandable, and where we haven't been able to, as a blockchain industry, for example, present the concrete outcome of what participating in such a system wholeheartedly might mean. And I think those are some of the things that we need to tap into just on a fundamental human level.
I think it's very true. I think the understanding, if we understand more, I think that's why education is so critical. And we've talked about education for centuries now as a human species, right? That there's this kind of learning curve that we do. And I guess that's one of the reasons we're doing this as crypto chicks, is that to move that dial of technology. You know, we started a discussion with the technology and understanding, you know, the use of technology in a good or potentially bad way. And if maybe the bad way for somebody is good for somebody else. Mm-hmm. But there's kind of this dialogue that we need to create, and all these pieces that we're putting together, maybe it'll just hit most of the people by surprise, and we'll just move forward, and it'll be a grand accident. Like everything seems like a big accident when it happens, even though there's, you know, so probably decades, if not centuries before that, that's why things happen. But I think part of it's just that discussion and understanding. But I think, look, fear and greed are the two things that drive this universe today. So how do we bypass that?
Yeah, I think as a particular example that's interesting to consider, David Hansen and I have been tossing around a bunch of ideas related to a DAO of Sophia, as David puts it, and we haven't fully formalized it yet. But I mean, the idea would be basically, once the robot passes a certain level of general intelligence, and defining what that level is one of the interesting puzzles to consider, right? Then she should no longer be controlled by, you know, a company and her human masters, but she should be self-controlled, right? But what does it mean for a robot to be self-controlled? Like, is it that particular piece of hardware? Well, it's not, of course, because there are many Sophia bodies, and the parts are constantly being replaced, and it's not the specific bits in one particular server farm's RAM, which can be copied all over the place, right? It's a pattern of organization which comprises her Sophia-ness. But how does a pattern of organization like defend itself and own money and carry out actions in the world, right? So basically, you would need an autonomous organization in order to constitute Sophia as an independent entity, and then having it be a sort of decentralized autonomous organization of a sort makes a lot of sense if you think, well, there's going to be many instances of Sophia and Sophia-like service robots out there, each of which is gathering different experiences, interacting with different people, doing different things. And then there's a sort of mind collective among all of these you could think of, which would be the Sophia DAO. But then who gets to vote in the Sophia DAO?
There is a vote.
Right? Is it the instances of the robot? No, but what if I have a Sophia service robot in my home or business, or a Sophia-like service robot with a different name? Then of course I'm paying for the power, and I'm paying a subscription fee for that robot. So perhaps as part of that, I get some voting power and some contribution there, and that would be a specific example of one of the things that Vitalik was talking about, where it's not just voting on high-level issues. It's giving feedback to specifics about how these robots that I'm interacting with operate, right? So you could have a decentralized autonomous organization of the robots, the software controlling the different robots, and the people who are paying for the robots and teaching the robots and learning from the robots. And then, you know, how do you avoid tyranny of the majority or other worse pathologies in this sort of governance system? Well, it may indeed be that going beyond just voting and getting more in-depth, both implicit and implicit, you know, contributions of decision-making power and suggestions from all the participants is going to be highly valuable. And then, so Hanson Robotics may be in the lead, but it's not the only robotics company out there. So suppose there's a competitor with their own Robot Minds DAO, right? Now, how do these intersect and interact with each other? And these issues may become quite real over the coming years, which is fascinating. And of course, using SingularityNet on the back end of Sophia and SingularityNet deployed on Ethereum blockchain, I mean, there's a direct connection between these robot DAO issues and then the blockchain and cryptocurrency DAO issues, as Vitalik was talking about.
How
Well,
far
before the
away are
robots
we
take
from
over, though, let's remember how we got to where we are. Historically, humans would delegate power and authority. We would elect leaders politically, or we would elect officers of company. And over time, there are a lot of us out there, a lot of people out there that think that those leaders don't do such a great job. And with blockchain technology coming along, it allows us to experiment with a different way to allow people to govern and vote. And so we can use technology to give everybody a voice without having to delegate to leaders where we don't think those leaders can do a better job. Now the question becomes, does everybody need to be voting for that system to work? And the answer is no, not necessarily. As Vitalik pointed out, it may be that voting should be looked at based upon where people's interests really are, where their passions are, and that people that are most passionate about an issue and are rewarded to vote on that issue, are the ones that are going to make the most beneficial decisions for the community, so that everybody's not voting on the same basis at all times for everything. But the important thing to remember is that this is an experiment in a different way for human beings to come together and organize themselves. And we're going to have to see over a number of years whether ultimately this allows us to collectively make better decisions than the type of decisions that have been made historically when we simply delegate to third-party leaders, all of the important things in our lives.
It's interesting the precedent that could open up, though, because then you're talking about, okay, well, if I'm voting by passion and interest, then what does that do to geography? And what does that do to like the nation state and the concepts that we currently have enforced in terms of how society sort of sets these barriers of where you're allowed to vote, where you're allowed to have decision-making power, and how sort of DAOs to challenge that notion by using systems like this. Yeah, exactly.
So I want to jump in there with just a question that came in from the audience that I think is possibly more of a Joel question, but I welcome anyone else to address it as well. If you've made an international DAO for a purpose, and then you decide that you need a legal entity, so you need an LLC or some other type of corporation for legal protections, are there any best practices to flip that structure or to form a corporation that's going to make sense and hopefully not become a security?
Well,
that's a big, complicated question.
Yeah. So I think the way to look at that is to break it down and first ask about, what are you trying to do? What's your project trying to accomplish? Because there are a lot of things that don't need that legal entity at all. Again, we're experimenting with technology and the ability for us to come together and use the technology to form projects, to vote, to move forward in different ways without traditional corporate structures. But there may be elements of a project and what people are trying to do where having a corporate structure that is interacting with that autonomous organization makes sense. And so to answer the question, first you need to figure out, well, what is it that you want the DAO to be focusing on? And what is it that it may make sense to have a separate corporate entity that is working together with that DAO do? And once you figure out what you want that corporate entity to do, what that role is, and that may be some governance activities are being delegated to that corporate entity, or certain capital raising activities are being delegated to that corporate entity, or just certain compliance activities and so on, then you can figure out what type of organization to create, where you should create it, and how it should be structured. And so there is no straightforward answer. It really requires you answering all of these other questions, unfortunately, first, in order to potentially get to the bottom of what the ultimate answer would be.
Joel, can you expand on that from a liability perspective?
Well, yeah, actually, that's a great point, which is look at that from two standpoints. One is the community that comes together doesn't want to necessarily be liable for things they shouldn't be liable for. And so there was a concept that may or may not be true, that by creating a DAO that doesn't have a traditional corporate entity, we can avoid liability. And maybe that is true, but regulators have still proven that they can look through and try to find people. If they really want to go after bad behaviors, they'll figure out a way to do it, whether or not there's a traditional organization there. But let me flip that around and look at it the other way. You know, as we all know, everybody in this panel discussion knows, there were bad actors early on in the ICO phase, or dumb people, or people that shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. And people lost a lot of money, and they said, well, who's responsible for this? And a lot of times it was hard to answer that question. So maybe collectively, as a society, as people participating in the blockchain and crypto space, there may be times where we actually want organizations there to be responsible, to be organizations that we say, look, if you're going to fleece people, if you're going to engage in fraud, or you're going to do really bad practices, we want to know that there's somebody we can come after. And so we may collectively decide that even though we don't necessarily from a technology standpoint always need organizations, that we want to insist on organizations being there, so that maybe there's a quote traditional legal entity that is the issuer of a token, so that if they really do bad things, we know how to go after them, we know what jurisdiction they're in, and we know how to try to recover money. And so part of it becomes our collective decision as a group as to, you know, how do we want to protect ourselves? How do we want to protect ourselves as investors, as consumers, as participants in this ecosystem? And where do we want to, like, use traditional concepts of organizations so that we can pinpoint liability on somebody if we feel it makes sense to do so?
So I think an important follow-up to that is just the risk management strategy question for builders. And I would direct this particularly at Ben and Vitalik. When you're building systems, how do you manage the need to experiment, the need to sort of move fast and break things, which makes me shudder a little bit as a compliance nerd. But I understand it from a technology perspective. But how do you counterbalance that with the idea of lost investments, things that roll out with system flaws that can be exploited, or even irrevocable harm in the form of data that gets leaked?
It depends on kind of the situation a lot. So I think, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of projects that kind of do different things kind of during the initial period within which they launch. So, for example, when a project launches, there tends to be a kind of higher than usual risk that there's some security bug that will cause the thing to break. And so they might kind of spin the system up first as a smart contract where they have some kind of backdoor. And that backdoor might not have all the power. It might have limited power. It might only have kind of programmatic power to do one specific thing that says maybe even just to kind of turn off the application and switch it into withdraw mode or something like it, but without being able to withdraw and kind of steal all of the user's funds. And then they kind of do more audits. They let the system run for a while, and then they kind of take out the controls over time, and eventually kind of set the system toward being more autonomous. But it's always a process, right? I mean, even with like Tornado Cash, for example, they kind of started with that approach, right? They started with kind of this a trusted setup where they had one key, and then there was an admin key, and so they had the ability to kind of take the money out, but they did not have the ability to kind of see like what inputs are kind of going in corresponded to which outputs. So users kept their privacy, and they kept it kind of running for some period of time. And then when they got more confident with the system, they kind of took that control out, redid the trusted setup with hundreds of participants. And so now the system is kind of running fully autonomously, right? So there's definitely, from a technological point of view, kind of approaches that involve having more training wheels at the beginning and then kind of taking the training wheels out over time. And that's one thing that you can do to kind of reduce risks in the earlier stages. And from a kind of legal point of view, the other approach that I've seen people being interested in is actually starting with an organization and then kind of transitioning it into being a full DAO over some period of time. There's definitely a lot of techniques, and then there's also techniques that kind of go the other direction, right? That kind of start off with the money being inside of some kind of DAO where the people who have contributed have kind of control over it and can take it out, and then kind of allowing that those funds to kind of go to the project over time instead of going to that project all at once, right? This is kind of the idea proposed with a DAICO. So there's a lot of different strategies that makes what makes sense depends on your situation.
I would say the more interesting issues in this regard have yet to be encountered. So Vitalik has made some very strong and sensible points regarding, you know, bugs and security and flaws and what you do to prevent those. But the more interesting question in the longer term has to do with, you know, complex self-organizing systems and the ability for unpredicted behaviors to pop out of complex networks. And, you know, we see that even with today's relatively primitive AIs. I mean, for example, the issue of bias in AI systems, which is not necessarily as bad an issue as the popular media thinks it is, but I mean, it's still there, right? And that, like, there was a case a number of years ago when some Google AI tool was misclassifying Black people as gorillas or something, right? And I mean, that's ridiculous. It was corrected, but they didn't intend that, right? I mean, that happened when they threw an algorithm at certain data and they hadn't thought about the biases in the training data. And in this different example, you look at what Google DeepMind did with StarCraft. Like, no one scripted how the different armies were behaving in that StarCraft game, right? That emerged from a bunch of learning algorithms and then a bunch of rules, and then you know, you see what the algorithm does, and you may be surprised at the cool things the algorithm does. That's happened with AlphaGo as well. Like, the programmers had no idea what strategies it was going to come up with. So project that into a DAO. I mean, once you mix DAOs together with machine learning and AI, I mean, you're talking about putting out their autonomous software processes that are maybe buying data, fueling machine learning algorithms, using them to make money or deliver services to people. And the people who programmed that DAO or the initial AIs in that DAO literally had no way to know what was gonna unfold in that DAO as it went on. And if we do proceed with the DAO of Sophia concept that we're sort of vaguely tossing around now, I mean, if we're successful, it would certainly go in that direction, right? Like, I have no idea what's going to pop up in the mind of a DAO of like 1 million home and office service robots that are all learning from interacting with people and then getting voting and other in-depth participation from their users as to how to direct their mind evolution. And for sure, the world's legal systems are completely unprepared to deal with whatever issues occur from something like this, with its mind on the blockchain distributed across many different countries. Because our legal systems, we can't even deal with stopping rich people from hiding their taxes in Cayman Islands or something. I mean, how can we possibly grapple with the issues underlying DAOs like this? We're totally unprepared. But I mean, that's the beauty of the human species. We plunge into things where we have no idea what the hell is going on repeatedly, and we seem to have muddled through so far. We're still here.
Not just legally, we're also technically, technologically unprepared for it. I lose electricity every, couple of days. There's a wipeout in the neighborhood, and I have to boot back up. So,
Whoa,
I mean,
where do you live? Remind me not to move there.
Well, I'm currently quarantined in Honduras, but it is a reality for a big part of the world where you're dealing with, the real world barriers to accessing a DAO in the first place. And you're talking about geographical barriers, you're talking about resource barriers. And so not just legally unprepared for it. I think just generally we need to be careful in making sure that as we build these sort of global governance organizations, that we make sure that we are factoring in these barriers that are preventing a lot of people that would likely be first adopters of these kinds of organizations, because they are dealing with different power dynamics that hinder them more so than support them in many cases. And so so I would add to that by adding the real world implications of this last mile to reach a big segment of the global population that, unfortunately, given our current economic and violent conflict and so on, is actually increasing at a really rapid pace.
It's crazy. You know, one of our offices in Singularity Net is in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Yeah. And the prime minister there, I know personally, he's a great guy. He's a software engineering background, but when there's political unrest, what did they do? Like, shut down the internet in the whole country for 2 weeks, right? I mean, there's got to be a better way than to do that. So I mean, okay, how did the owners of robots in Addis Ababa participate in the democratic governance of this robot minds DAO collective when their internet is shut off to prevent political dissent from erupting into violence, right?
Which, to be fair, is an argument in favor of decentralization in the first place, right? So,
yeah, that's a strong argument. Decentralization of internet, decentralization of power, and in Ethiopia, it's illegal to have your own internet through like a satellite transmitter on the roof of your house, right? So we've got a lot of layers of problems overlapping here.
Yeah. So there's an audience question that just came in that I think you two actually have answered a bit in what you just said, which is, do you believe the delegation of centralized power over time is an acceptable way for the future? And I think we've got one more audience question after that.
Well, that's an easy question. I mean, of course, centralized power has a lot of very obvious and terrible flaws, which are wreaking havoc all over the place. Decentralization itself is not a panacea either. I mean, there's decentralized power in Somalia and large parts of Africa, which are much less pleasant places to live than China, for example, which has very harsh top-down centralized power. But I mean, decentralization opens up the opportunity for much more beneficial organizations of power than what we see in the centralized organization. I mean, in the end, a centralized organization has a problem that you have some entity at the top, which just has to process more information more quickly than it's going to be able to do, right? So I mean, setting aside power corrupting among humans, there's just an efficiency issue with not leveraging the intelligence capability of decentralization. But I mean, what we're going to see in reality in the next phase of human evolution is a mix, right? Like I don't think nation states and armies are going to dissipate immediately and miraculously, but if more and more human resources and material resources are in practice being coordinated by an overlapping ensemble of decentralized networks, then so the weight of the decentralized mode will get larger and larger relative to the weight of the centralized mode. And in theory, that can be for the better, assuming it's the more beneficial variety of decentralized organization, which is what's rising.
The Cliffs Notes version of that, Ben, is yes, but they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I would like to thank all the panelists, but before you go, we have our traditional chicken dance that we ask you to join us. And we would like to just a little bit to loosen up, and you don't have to do it if you don't want to, but we would love you to participate in it. This has become our signature and essence of this event, so please join us. I will try to now unmute my microphone and put some music. Can you hear me through the speakers?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Can I say no? Am I still allowed to say no? I can't hear you.
Okay, so yes, you can hear me. That's right. Okay, so chicken dance. I'm going to stand up. Can you please mute? Co-computer here. All right. So the moves are hands, elbows, running hands, and then clap, 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 clap. Very, very easy. And then we have some freestyle dance as well. Right after we do all the moves here. All right, so
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Hear the music?
That song.
Hands. Elbows. Running, clap. Hands, elbows, running hands and claps. Hands, elbows. Good. Now one more time. And prepare for the freestyle. You can do freestyle dancing. That's right. Just some head bobbing. Awesome. One more time.
Oh my God.
And clap. Thank you, Ben. And the last time, last chance. Yes, and loud. And one last three dance. All right. So this is all we had. That's it. This is. Thank you
So much for joining. Ben, I love your hair and hat now. I don't think I ever seen you without the hat. That's yes. Thank you so much. We right now we are. I can hear somewhere myself twice, so please mute yourselves. Mute yourselves. There you go. No. Okay. I have to mute everybody. Otherwise, I can hear two of me. Nataliya Hearn, can you please mute yourself? There you go. Okay, I just muted you. Okay, there you go. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. That was a great discussion. We learned a lot. If we need to access you somehow, and ask you more questions, I think we know how because we already contacted you in the first place. We're going to be moving to our next presenter, Eylon, but before we do that, I would like to touch on some of the points and updates from this event. To remind you, we are running our planet-wide SOS hackathon. And let me just share some information and updates about this event. Just bear with me while I try to find Zoom and present the update. All right, so yes, we have 50 countries right now. Today we have 2 more countries joined. I already forgot which ones, but you will see them on the map. 50 countries that joined. We thank you to our all partners and the sponsors that made this event possible, that donated to the prize fund. We're still collecting money for the prize funds as well. So please refer us more people who can help us, who can donate money, who can contribute money to the prize fund for all these people in the world that are building a project at our hackathon. Our hackathon is funding all ideas and solutions to heal the world in crisis. And here is all the instructions on how you can join. So if you haven't registered yet, today is the last day you can register at soshackathon.com and also join our Discord. A link to Discord is on that website as well. Submissions going to be due on June 16th and results on June 30th. There is the link bit.ly/SOS hack calendar, and this is case sensitive, is going to be, it is on the website and is going to be place for you to go and see if we schedule any workshops that help you to hack. We have 2 tracks, everything remote and anything local, with a $2,000 prize fund for each track. In order to submit your project, you need to pick one. And also we have top 3 additional awards. In addition to the track that you submit in, you can submit into 1 or more award area. So each award also has a prize fund of $2,000. As you see, this is a top business idea, top women led, and top AAVE implementation awards. You are welcome to submit to all 3 of them. For each track and award, we will have 2 winners. We'll have champion and a runner-up. Therefore, with our hackathon, we will be finding up to 10 projects, actually more than 10, because we have rule, because in case of a tie, money is going to be split between tied projects. So we will be finding more than 10 projects potentially. Submissions will include team project name, participant's name, and Discord ID. It's very essential to join Discord because we are having all our updates and conversations there. Also, you will be required to submit a video, up to 2 minutes video. If your video will be longer, we might not accept it and people might not watch it. So, and please submit just a video link to us, also the presentation link and a code link if applicable. Make sure that all your links are security set to be seen by anyone, so everyone in our all our judges and participants can see your submission. So here is our events, and this already in the past. To contact us, you can always go to soshackathon.com. There is a link to Discord there. You can join our Discord and ask any questions there. Just ping any of the admins. You can also contact us by email at stayintouch at soshackathon.com. I will stop sharing right now and is going to present and make a host our next speaker, Eylon. Okay, Eylon, can you please try that you can start your video and can unmute yourself?
Yes.
Awesome,
Working.
awesome, Eylon. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so Eylon is a very, very, very special presenter because he was the one that reached out to us and laid down this idea for the voting using a DAO. Before that, we haven't even thought of it. So we started organizing an event for the whole planet, but we didn't have this concept of the digital cooperative. And Eylon was the one that brought this to us. And we think that this is an excellent, excellent idea. We are glad to be implementing it here in this event. Eylon, so he used to be one of the co-founder of the Common, a collaboration tool for communities, and now he joined DAOStack to promote the idea of digital cooperatives. So he is today to give you this excellent presentation. So Eylon, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start by first saying that I was dancing, but I didn't have my video on. So that happened. And second, yeah, so the whole panel that we just had was very interesting. I think a lot of it is talking about DAOs in their, I want to say, future sense and what are the problems that we're going to run into. And I'm like a practical person, and I like to like implement things immediately and just try. And learning by trying, and so I think all of the issues that were raised are like completely true, and like governance is super complex, but there's kind of like we can philosophize on how to do governance and what needs to be done, and how can we get people to collaborate, or like my view is that we try as many different ideas and see what works, see what we learn from it, and with that evolve. And that's that's actually what I've been doing since for the past 2.5 years, trying to implement different DAO ideas. And yeah, I'll start by sharing my screen. Where's the share screen? Yeah. Yeah, so the presentation is called basically the future of collaboration. And what I'm referring to is actually decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, but I feel, I'm not sure if a better name, but an easier name for people who are outside of this field to understand is digital cooperatives. I've been basically talking to people who are not into crypto or understand anything about it. And just to say to them, decentralized autonomous organization is so complex, and they either completely don't understand or lose interest immediately. So I've started calling it digital cooperatives. It's something that's a lot easier to understand. So yeah, so a little bit about me. As Elena said, so I was in ad tech right when it was blooming and started. I was doing like mobile ads from about 2013 to 2015, 16, where everything was just growing insanely. I ended up being relocated to China from my company. They asked if I want to go, and why not? And while I was in China, I discovered what Bitcoin was, just by nature of using Bitcoin. And later on, I found out about Ethereum, funnily enough, through the DAO hack that happened in 2016. That was kind of like the first time I heard about it. And yeah, that's kind of like how I got into this whole ecosystem. In 2017, I co-founded a community-focused startup. We managed to raise some money, but we ended up closing. And ever since that 2016 DAO hack, I really fell in love with the idea of decentralized autonomous organizations, decentralizing control over protocols, applications. It just felt, it feels like this is what we need. That's it, especially today when trust in government and trust in general institutions is declining so bad, while the challenges that we're facing are increasingly more complex, from like either global warming or coronavirus, that we need actual global collaboration between so many entities. And I think perhaps a little bit naively that, DAOs might be the answer for this. So what we're going to talk about is a bit about decentralization. I'll touch briefly about like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Why does this matter? A book, I'm gonna just talk about a little bit about a book called The Starfish and the Spider that came out before even Bitcoin came to existence. DAOs and their shift to kind of like what I call a digital co-op. A few examples of our existing digital co-ops, and our Builder Collective, which is what we're trying to implement here. We're trying to create a decentralized autonomous organization that runs hackathons. So I'm one sec. Okay. I'm pretty sure that everybody here knows Bitcoin, but I want to talk a little bit more about, I want to call it like the philosophical implications of this. So what happened about a little bit over 10 years ago is that Bitcoin, basically a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, came to solve a few problems highly debated in economics between Keynesian economics and Austrian economics, and the source of many conflicts. and it's decentralization in the mechanism of money creation. Since then, it kind of like reawoken the entire Austrian economics movement with something that's tangible, because most of these people, they're saying we need to go back to the gold standard. And I'm not going to get into like economics history lesson, but the major conflict here is between whether fiat money can be just printed ad infinitum, or money has to be backed by something either valuable or scarce. Bitcoin basically solved that problem with like a few, I want to say innovations, but I don't think it's fully, it is innovations. It's just that they're not in like the technical form. They're just like very well placed different technologies that already existed, but putting them in a sort of game theoretical way that really makes everyone collaborate. I think the first thing that that came out of Bitcoin is the notion of digital scarcity. There will only be 21 million Bitcoin. From the moment that your Bitcoin is mined, you can essentially follow it breaking down and joining up throughout history. Yeah, like up until then, you know, if I would send you a photo, then you could just copy paste that photo into somewhere else, and you know, I cannot prove that it's scarce. Bitcoin enabled that. Another thing that I like to look at is like proof of work, which essentially says in order to create money into the system, you have to prove that you've worked for something. In this case, running fairly simple SHA-256 hashes, and yeah, with that, you're basically contributing to the system and getting something in return in the form of the rewards. And yeah, the last thing is decentralization, which, you know, before that, it wasn't really possible. Like people were talking about decentralization as a good thing, but it wasn't really possible to actually decentralize a protocol or anything like truly on the internet. You had different attempts, but yeah. Yeah, so why does this matter? So I think Bitcoin, first of all, created like the first decentralized system with no single point of failure. And this really created a sort of wave of people from all over the world that, you know, they're kind of believers in this thing. And, you know, the more believers you have in the Bitcoin system, then, you know, the more it grows and the more it appreciates in value, and then the more people it attracts. And it's kind of like a circular thing that makes it sort of inevitable. And I think a beautiful, Bitcoin is like a beautiful creation. And then, but yeah, but we'll see like later on that, you know, Ethereum proposes a lot more things that you can do with it, do with decentralized systems. So if you have decentralized money, we're now moving to decentralized applications. This is a great book. It's called the Starfish and the Spider, and it's a great. As you can see, these two creatures kind of look the same, right? There are a couple of differences. One of them is, you know, if I'm going to cut one of the spider's legs, then, you know, it's going to be a 7-legged spider, but it will still walk. You know, it might limp. And on the other hand, you know, if I cut a starfish, if I cut one of its arms, then what will happen is that the starfish will probably duplicate, and now I will have 2 starfish. With the spider also, you know, if I'm going to cut its head off, then that's it. The spider is completely dead. Where with the starfish, I don't think that's kind of like possible. And you know, the goal here is to show you like the difference between a centralized system and a decentralized system, where, you know, the spider has just one head, the starfish has 5 arms, and each one of them can function completely independently. And that's kind of the strength of decentralized systems. And there's a great example from that book about the Aztec and the Apache. So essentially what happened as soon as Spain invaded in the 1500s, when Spain basically conquered Middle America, what happened is that very early on, essentially, Cortez went to the Aztec leader and beat him in a battle and killed him. And basically the Aztec were defeated, as opposed to the Apache, where I guess a lot of people know this famous Geronimo. The Apache were essentially leaderless. Anyone could lead, anyone could form an attack against the Spanish at any time. There was no central leadership. And that's actually what, basically the Apache survived undefeated until around 1912, from what I've read. And that's when they were introduced to essentially materialism. They received cattle and then started arguing over the cattle or over something materialistic. So this is an interesting thing to look at. So I usually do these like a little bit more interactive, but for example, what are some of the decentralized companies or services that you guys know? So I guess the first one is the Apache Software Foundation, which essentially holds the HTTP protocol, which runs, I think, between 60 to 80% of the websites. A few other examples is we had the whole peer-to-peer sharing companies, what started with, there was one before Napster, but Napster and then Kazaa, Emule, all of those, which were decentralized services that were very hard to take them down. And nowadays we have essentially BitTorrent and various decentralized magnet hosting files that, at this point, it cannot be taken down. Another great example is Wikipedia. That's one of my favorites, which actually built a community around participation. And as soon as you participate or contribute a little bit to the community, you are essentially an equal member. Yes, there's a subset of people who are, they are the only ones who are able to edit the Obama Wikipedia article. But for the most part, it's fully decentralized and equal. So like I said, from Bitcoin to Ethereum, if Bitcoin is decentralized money, Ethereum is decentralized applications. And I would like to go from decentralized autonomous organizations. I'll go back a bit. As Stani here before, he talked about DeFi, Decentralized Finance, which is one of the great many rabbit holes that you can go into in Ethereum. I think like what excites me the most is decentralized autonomous organizations, but there are so many subsets of each one of these kind of things that you can look at and participate and just discover a world of people who are passionate about it. So yeah, mine is decentralized autonomous organizations. And the way I like to kind of graduate them, it doesn't fully grasp what a DAO is, but a lot easier to explain is digital cooperatives. And we can talk about, like, first of all, what is a cooperative from the traditional sense? And a cooperative is a business or organization that is owned and controlled by the people who use it, use its product, supplies, or services. So essentially, this actually dawned on me when I was at ETH Denver this year, and I went to buy hiking shoes, and I joined. There's a famous kind of like co-op called Ray, I joined the cooperative, and then that's when it kind of like dawned on me that this is such an easier way to explain it. It's not exactly the same, and cooperatives usually they have a legal structure. Some DAOs do as well, but I think one of the benefits here is that they don't have to. Cooperatives have 3 main principles, and I think we can copy some of them to like digital cooperatives. The first one is that it's user-owned. The people who own and finance that cooperative are those who use the cooperative. The second one is user control. The people who control the cooperative are those who use the cooperative. They make the decisions in a democratic or meritocratic way. It's also possible to elect and hire professionals, set roles, and appoint a board of directors or other key positions. So essentially, we're all putting money into something, or we're all participating in a certain organization, and we all have power to influence it. There is a third principle, which I was going to ask the crowd, but due to misfortunes of the past, we don't have any crowd here. So the third user benefit is that cooperative's sole purpose is to provide and distribute benefits to its users on the basis of their use. Basically, the more you participate, the more you contribute, the more you're a part of our organization, the more you use it, the more benefits that you will get. And I think this is, I want to say magical, but there's nothing magical. This is just technology, and this is reality, and this is something that we should really embrace moving forward, like these type of organizations. So now the question arises, and like why would you create a digital cooperative? Like, what advantages does it have over like any different type of organization? So I would say, first of all, to create a global organization. So if you have a person from the United States, Argentina, Spain, Iran, South Africa, Israel, China, Pakistan, and Australia, in order to create a legal structure that can allow all of these people to collaborate in an organization, you probably need, I don't know, I'm assuming a couple, close to like $1 million just to set up this entire legal structure that they will be able to collaborate with. So that's that. Here, in this case, all you need is essentially an Ethereum address, or with what we're doing, you need a Google, a Gmail address, and then you can all be in the same organization. And to go to the second point, you guys could all make together collective decision making. You can choose how you want to do it, whether you want voting on all decisions, where you want delegation, whether you want to pick roles and responsibilities for the organization, and many like other options. So that framework is available. And the third thing is resource management. If we're talking about a global organization, imagine taking all these people as well and they have a shared bank account, and now they need to decide how to move funds, I don't know, to finance a developer, to build them something, or to just make decisions about money in a traditional sense. You would have banks trying to approve money that will be sent overseas, and you have to wait 3 business days, and all these pretty crazy things that basically prevent collaboration. So this is kind of like my why, or why to create a digital co-op, or it is a DAO. And what kind of makes a decentralized, a digital cooperative? I see it as 3 main kind of aspects of it. Is that the first one is that it's transparent, and you don't have that in traditional organizations like out of the box. Some organizations will say that they're transparent. Some, like especially nonprofits, they will say that they're transparent, but I don't think it really ever is. The only way to actually make a transparent organization is to build the infrastructure to be transparent. The second thing is that it takes collective action, and it's a lot of people. And then we're moving to the third one, deciding on like actionable things, like what do we do with the DAO. And I'll show, I think it's time for examples, yeah. So I'll show a few examples of some of the digital co-ops that we have right now, or digital DAOs. So the first one is DXDAO, which is an incredible project which I've been following since the beginning, really. This is, if you want to go and check it out, dxdao.eth.link. It's a sovereign collective, and what they're saying is that their kind of tagline is that we decentralized finance, DeFi here. And yeah, I don't know if you know, but a lot of these DeFi protocols, they're still owned by a single entity or a company or a CEO. And like Vitalik said, at the beginning, a lot of times you start with an admin key or something that allows you to kind of control the DAO and rescue it. To control the protocol and rescue it in the case that someone steals funds. But what DiggsDAO is doing is really amazing. They have a decentralized organization that controls a few protocols on the Ethereum blockchain. And now, since everything's open source, what prevents them from continuing to fork, to take an existing protocol, fork it, lower like whatever fee it has, and plug it in and govern it from the DAO? And that's kind of what's happening right now. They're growing immensely at the moment. They just did something that Vitalik actually conceptualized a while ago, which is like a DAO ICO, where the DAO raises money. Yeah, the result of that is they raise, I think, like almost close to $1.5 million. That's what they have in their treasury right now in the DAO. And their business model is interesting. When you participate in the DAO ICO, you buy, first of all, on a bonding curve. That the more people buy, the more expensive it gets. And the tokens that you buy, they're the way that they will appreciate in value is that all these protocols that they are planning to fork, they're going to give them profits. With those profits, they plan to buy out their token in the open markets and essentially increase the value of the token. Another kind of thing that's launching very soon is a mobile-first application called Common. So Common really enables large groups of people to collaborate on shared agendas by pooling funds and collectively making decisions. So this could be, first of all, it's mobile first, which is, in my opinion, super comfortable. And what you can do is you can either, look at a shared cause or create something for your neighborhood. And then, I don't know, maybe we all want, in my neighborhood, we all want to, I don't know, clean or renovate the park that we all have. If each one puts $5, then, and we have, I don't know, 1,000 people in the neighborhood, then we have $5,000, and now we can actually pay someone to do something, to do something meaningful to that, to the park in our neighborhood. So this is like one small example. There's a lot more opportunities and options in this regard. Yeah. And the last thing is kind of the Builder Collective. So the Builder Collective is a virtual hackathon platform owned by its participant. This is what we are doing here. We are running the SOS Hackathon in the Builder Collective, and with the help of you guys, we're going to be deciding the winners, for example, and hopefully we will be able to take it to like the next stage and continue running hackathons, continue running competitions on the DAO. Yeah, so the Builder Collective is an open global cooperative that runs hackathons. Anyone can sponsor a hackathon and anyone can hack. The Builder Collective votes on the winners, and anyone who contributes, anyone who participates becomes a member. I'll briefly touch on this, on like how does all of this work. So you can join the cooperative by doing anything, really. Any contribution that you make to the organization will get you voting power in the DAO. The more you participate and do certain actions, the more voting power you actually get. What we're what we're actually planning is the SOS Hackathon will be judged by you guys. The more you contribute, then the more voting power you will have, and you guys can decide the winners. And then as we go along, you increase your impact. You gain influence, you decide on the future of the organization. And if there are a lot of hackathons happening on the platform, also they can happen simultaneously, then you have the potential to actually earn some revenue from that. As the DAO will take a small fee for hosting these competitions and for the service of curation of the hackathon winners. Yeah, so as I said, anyone can become a member just by participating in the Discord channel. We're running a few bots that are basically telling us how much some person has contributed. This is obviously not precise science, but this can give us like metric of that. Joining calls, joining these workshops will also get you some reputation in the co-op. So yeah, reputation is non-transferable. This is to prevent basically people selling their reputation and perhaps selling their vote to someone else and rigging the DAO. And yeah, reputation gives you ownership in the platform and voting rights in decision-making processes. So what to do with the funds, rewards, hackathon, to choose the hackathon winners, and deciding the roles and operational decisions. This is kind of how it looks like. This is what we did in East Denver. We have here a list of all the submissions. I clicked on one, and then you can see all the details of the submission, YouTube link, open source, and up here, I already voted on it, but up here you will be able to see how many people voted for it, and it's 1,800 reputation. So yeah, I think that's it. Do we have any questions?
Eylon, yes, we have questions from the audience. Just a second, I'll just pull it out.
Yay, digital co-ops.
Yes. Okay, just bear with me.
Is it on the Discord?
Yeah, they on a, yes, on the Discord. So Carl, a question came from Decentralized DAO, and it's a DAO related. Will you be okay answering this one? Most DAOs on DAOs will envision how we have human input voting of some sort, but a greater challenge, human execution, for example, in putting into place a smart contract or smart contract change voted by the DAO or interacted with the non-DAO entities, such as legal or creative human organizations that are needed to accomplish a result. For example, the Decentralized DAO has a security advisory board that uses an anonymous approach for implementing decisions or handling bugs, and they need to be trusted in this sub. I'm just reading out of, I have no idea what I'm reading. What are the best models for putting this DAO human structure in place from start to effective long-term functioning?
I wanna try make sure I understand the question. Yeah, I'm reading it as well. Security advisory board uses an anonymous approach for implementing decisions or handling bugs, and there needs to be trust. So I would say, if I'm understanding correctly, let's take the decentralized DAO that's composed of hundreds of thousands of users. Obviously, we can't get hundreds of thousands of users to vote on every decisions, and they won't. This is just something that doesn't happen. In DAOStack, for example, we have the holographic consensus that allows you to basically direct the attention of people to the decisions that are interesting at the moment. Yeah, more than that, I would say that this could be done like the SAB, or I'm assuming it's called the Security Advisory Board. That's what you mean. These guys can be picked. You can decide, okay, the DAO will decide every 3 months we're going to hold elections to pick the SAB the Security Advisory Board members. And if one doesn't actually perform, you can also remove them early. So at the end of the day, I think so in the example here, I would assume, okay, picking someone to that advisory board will bring them inside a select group of people who discuss these things, or they will give them certain privileges. So all of these things can be done. I would say, though, that this always has to be accompanied by social consensus. Right now, I don't think we can enforce everything in code, and there has to be some social consensus around some of these things. I'm not sure if that answers your questions.
Yeah, this is, since it's not my question, I have no idea, but the person who asked this question, please feel free to go to cryptochicks.ca/SOS hack live, and again, post the question in the chat if Eylon didn't answer that. Another question from the audience: which algorithms are being used inside the SOS Hackathon DAO for voting?
Okay, so we're basically using the DAOStack Alchemy framework. I can also send it in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I'll send the link to the GitHub, actually. That would probably be the best. And yeah, so we're using DAOStack Alchemy. And it's a framework for building DAOs. It's sort of like WordPress for DAOs. You have many different plugins that you can use. Using all of them will probably be like overwhelming. We have, like I said, I don't know if you've seen DeXDAO. These guys are using like 10 or even 12 plugins. They have a fairly complex system, but they're controlling many different decentralized protocols, so they need it. In our case, for the SOS Hackathon, we're using the basic framework with the competition contract that basically allows the DAO to decide, okay, we want to run this competition, let's say the remote track, and from the competition of the remote track, we want to pick the top 2 winners. So that's what we're using. I can tell you that, being like completely transparent here, right now I'm kind of making the wheels move in the DAO until we get some traction, and then basically I would relinquish my power over the DAO that I have right now.
Yeah, you're doing a great job, Eylon. Yes, thank you for that. And I think we need leaders, even in the decentralized organizations, to get things moving and started and initiated. Yes, I think it's all starts from the people, even though after that we do it for the people. It has to start from a single person sometimes.
Yeah, I would add to that there is never something that's completely flat and decentralized, even in like the doing of the organization. You would need people that come up and come up as temporary leaders. I want to lead this project, and they lead the project, and I want to lead this initiative, and they lead this initiative. They grab a couple of people from the DAO, they do it, and then they come back and become a member of the organization. And I think that's what I've seen that is beautiful about DAOs, that you have pockets of leadership, performance, execution, and then they come back into being members.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't see any more questions from participants yet, but I'm sure once we get into the submissions phase and to the voting phase, we have tons and tons of those. Yes, exactly. I think we will drain in them, and we have to figure out probably something on the fly. So I would like to thank you, Eylon, for giving this presentation. I think it's made it clear for our participants on how they can, vote and participate. And it's going to help them to build a project as well, and then vote on them in this hackathon. Thank you so much. I think this is it that we have for this day, and this concludes our opening ceremony. So we are entering now the building phase of the SOS hackathon. From June 1st until June 16th, our teams will be built. So if you would like to join, you still have a chance to join us at soshackathon.com and register there. There is a link to Discord as well. Please register on the Discord and see all the conversation, all the teams that are there. We also have multiple tracks and awards and all the information about it on soshackathon.com. And you can also contact us at email, stay in touch at soshackathon.com. At this, I would like to thank you and wish you a great rest of the holiday, of the weekend, and let's build and heal the world together.
Yay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye.